The name, Ernest Hemingway, resonates across decades, a sound familiar even to those who have never turned a single page of his prose. It is a name that drifts through the collective memory, carrying with it associations of adventure, of stark landscapes, of a particular kind of masculine stoicism. This echo, however, is often a simplification, a silhouette cast by the bright light of his public persona, rather than a detailed rendering of the intricate life that unfolded beneath it. Before delving into the chronology of his days, it is perhaps useful to pause and consider this name, this cultural artifact, as it exists in the quiet spaces of our understanding. It evokes images, a beard weathered by sun and sea, a gaze fixed on a distant horizon, a rifle held with practiced ease, a typewriter humming in the early morning light. And these are fragments, powerful in their symbolism, yet they offer only glimpses into the man who lived. The story of Ernest Hemingway is not merely a collection of dramatic events or a chronicle of literary achievements. It is a slow unfolding, a narrative woven from the threads of experience, observation, and internal struggle. It is the journey of a sensibility shaped by war and peace, by love and loss, by the relentless pursuit of an authentic expression. The legend, often larger than life, has tended to overshadow the human being, the individual navigating the complexities of his own existence amidst the tumultuous currents of the 20th century. To approach his life with a quiet mind is to begin to discern the subtle textures beneath the bold strokes of the myth. It is to move beyond the well-worn anecdotes and the celebrated pronouncements, seeking instead the steady rhythm of his development, the evolution of his craft, and the enduring questions that preoccupied his mind. This endeavour requires a patient observation, a willingness to trace the intricate patterns of a life lived with intensity, a life that, despite its outward vigour, was frequently marked by an interior quietude. We begin not with a roar, but with a whisper, listening to the distant echo of a name and preparing to understand the substance behind the sound. To truly comprehend the trajectory of Ernest Hemingway's life, it is necessary to first understand the ground upon which he first stood. The America into which he was born in the summer of 1899 was a nation poised at a significant historical threshold. The 19th century had just concluded, leaving behind a discernible cultural residue, while the nascent 20th century was already beginning to assert its own distinct character. This was an era still deeply imbued with Victorian sensibilities, a time when decorum, moral rectitude, and a certain societal conservatism held considerable sway. The prevailing values emphasized self-control, diligent work, and a clear distinction between public presentation and private feeling. A veneer of propriety often veiled underlying anxieties and desires, creating a complex social landscape where outward appearances were meticulously maintained. Homes were often adorned with heavy furnishings, reflecting a desire for solidity and permanence, and public discourse frequently adhered to established norms of respectability. Yet, beneath this established surface, the currents of modernity were gathering strength. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the landscape, bringing with it new technologies that promised to reshape daily life. Electricity was slowly illuminating cities, the automobile was transitioning from novelty to practical invention, and the telephone was beginning to connect distant voices. These innovations were not merely mechanical advancements. They were harbingers of a profound shift in human experience, accelerating the pace of life and broadening horizons in unprecedented ways. Culturally, America was experiencing a quiet ferment. While European artistic movements were often seen as avant-garde, there was a growing desire for a distinct American voice in literature and art. The works of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman had, in their own ways, as challenged conventional forms and a new generation of writers and artists was beginning to emerge, eager to explore the realities of a rapidly changing nation. Politically, the country was consolidating its position on the global stage, having recently emerged from the Spanish-American War with new territories and a heightened sense of national purpose. The progressive movement was gaining momentum, advocating for social reforms and challenging the entrenched powers of industrial magnates. There was an underlying, often unarticulated sense of impending change, a feeling that the old order was subtly giving way to something new, something less certain, but potentially more dynamic. This was the atmosphere, a blend of tradition and nascent transformation, that would form the initial backdrop to Ernest Hemingway's formative years, and subtly influencing the perspectives he would later adopt in the world he would come to observe. Ernest Hemingway's initial world was circumscribed by the orderly streets of Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb situated just west of Chicago. It was here, in a substantial Victorian house, that he entered life. Oak Park, at the turn of the century, was not merely a residential area. It was an embodiment of certain American ideals, a community that prided itself on its stability, its prosperity, and its deeply ingrained moral framework. The village was known for its conservative ethos. Its residents, many of whom were successful professionals and merchants, valued decorum, respectability, and a clear adherence to social norms. The architecture itself, with its grand, often ornate homes, spoke of established wealth and a desire for permanence. This was a place where appearances mattered, where community standards were upheld, and where deviation from the expected path was generally met with quiet disapproval. Religion played a significant role in the daily fabric of Oak Park life. Protestantism, in its various denominations, provided a moral compass for many families, including the Hemingways. Church attendance was customary, and the teachings of the Bible often informed household rules and community expectations. Sunday was a day of rest and reflection, distinct from the working week, and public entertainments were generally restrained. This religious undercurrent fostered an environment where concepts of sin, redemption, and moral duty were frequently discussed, shaping the ethical landscape of childhood. Education was also highly valued in Oak Park. The schools were well regarded, emphasizing traditional academic subjects and instilling a sense of discipline. Children were encouraged to excel, to cultivate intellectual curiosity, and to prepare for respectable futures. The expectations placed upon young Ernest were those of a bright, well-behaved boy from a good family, destined for a life of professional achievement and community engagement. This structured, somewhat sheltered upbringing in Oak Park stands in quiet juxtaposition to the public persona Hemingway would later cultivate and the experiences he would actively seek out. The calm, predictable rhythms of his early life, characterized by a certain provincialism and an emphasis on conventionality, offered a stark contrast to the distant battlefields, the wild landscapes, and the often tumultuous relationships that would define his adult years. The seeds of his future wanderlust and his eventual rebellion against societal constraints may have in part been sown in the very soil of this respectable Midwestern town, a quiet reaction against its pervasive order. Within the structured environment of the Oak Park home, the personalities and aspirations of Ernest Hemingway's parents exerted a profound and often contradictory influence on his development. His father, Dr. Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, was a physician, a man of science and the outdoors. He possessed a deep love for nature, particularly for hunting and fishing, activities he enthusiastically shared with his son from a very young age. Dr. Hemingway was a quiet, earnest man, dedicated to his profession and to providing for his family. He instilled in Ernest a respect for the natural world, an appreciation for self-reliance, and a practical understanding of skills like tracking and marksmanship. His aspirations for Ernest were perhaps conventional, a successful, upstanding member of the community, perhaps following in his medical footsteps or pursuing another respectable profession. Grace Hall Hemingway, Ernest's mother, was a woman of considerable talent and ambition, though her avenues for expression were somewhat circumscribed by the era. She had trained as an opera singer, possessing a powerful voice and a strong artistic sensibility. After losing her sight temporarily, she turned to painting, demonstrating a notable aptitude. Grace was a more flamboyant and assertive figure than her husband, with a keen interest in culture, music, and the arts. Yet she envisioned a more refined artistic path for her son, encouraging his musical talents and fostering an appreciation for beauty and expression. There was a certain theatricality to Grace, a desire for recognition that contrasted with her husband's more reserved demeanour. These differing approaches to life and parenting naturally led to a complex family dynamic. Dr. Hemingway's pragmatic, outdoors-oriented worldview often clashed with Grace's artistic and somewhat more demanding nature. While both parents loved their children, their methods of demonstrating that love and their expectations for their eldest son were frequently at odds. Dr. Hemingway taught Ernest the quiet patience of the fisherman, the discipline of the hunter, and the scientific observation of the natural world. Grace, conversely, might dress young Ernest and his elder sister Marceline in identical outfits, sometimes blurring gender distinctions in a way that later biographers have often noted. She encouraged him to play the cello, to appreciate classical music, and to engage with creative pursuits. These early tensions within the household, the subtle and overt differences between his parents' values, created a fertile ground for internal conflict within young Ernest. He was drawn to his father's rugged independence and connection to nature, yet he also inherited aspects of his mother's artistic sensitivity and perhaps her underlying ambition. The desire to please both, or perhaps to define himself distinctly from both, became an unconscious undercurrent in his formative years, shaping his early personality and contributing to the complex individual he would become. This dual heritage, of the practical and the artistic, the stoic and the expressive, laid a foundational layer in the intricate tapestry of Ernest Hemingway's life. While Oak Park provided a structured and somewhat formal backdrop to Ernest Hemingway's early years, it was in the wilder landscapes of northern Michigan that his deepest connections to the natural world were forged. Each summer, the Hemingway family would retreat from the suburban civility to their cottage, Windermere, nestled on the shores of Walloon Lake. This was a seasonal migration that profoundly shaped Ernest, offering a stark contrast to his life in Illinois. The lake country, with its dense forests, clear waters, and abundant wildlife, became a sanctuary and a classroom. Here, far from the urban constraints, Ernest was immersed in an environment that celebrated self-sufficiency and direct engagement with nature. His father, Dr. Clarence Hemingway, was the primary guide in these wilderness excursions. From the earliest age, Ernest was taught to fish, to handle a canoe, and to navigate the woods. These were not mere recreational activities, but lessons in observation, patience, and the practicalities of survival. The rhythm of life at Walloon Lake was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the movements of fish in the water, and the calls of birds in the trees. Fishing in particular became a foundational activity. Ernest spent countless hours on the lake, learning the subtle art of casting, the identification of different species, and the quiet contemplation that fishing often demands. It was an activity that required focus and a deep understanding of the environment, skills that would later resonate in his writing. He learned to read the water, to understand the habits of trout and bass, and to appreciate the delicate balance of the ecosystem. These were not abstract lessons, but visceral experiences, felt through the tension on a fishing line and the cool spray of the lake. Beyond fishing, Ernest also learned to hunt with his father. This introduced him to the cycle of life and death in the wild, the responsibility inherent in taking an animal's life, and the quiet discipline required for the pursuit. He developed a keen eye for detail, an understanding of tracking, and a respect for the power and beauty of wild creatures. The forest surrounding Walloon Lake became his playground and his training ground, a place where he could explore, learn, and develop a sense of rugged independence. These childhood summers in Michigan were more than just vacations. They were an education in themselves. They fostered in Ernest a deep, almost spiritual connection to the outdoors that would endure throughout his life and permeate much of his literary work. The landscapes, the sounds, the smells, and the experiences of Walloon Lake became indelible parts of his memory and his imaginative landscape, forming a crucial bedrock upon which his future identity and artistic vision would be built. The quiet authority of nature, learned in these Michigan wilds, would echo in the narratives he crafted for decades to come. Returning from the wild expanses of Walloon Lake, Ernest Hemingway re-entered the more structured world of education in Oak Park. His formal schooling began at the public schools of his hometown, a system renowned for its high standards and emphasis on traditional academic subjects. Ernest was not, by all accounts, an exceptionally diligent student in every area. While he demonstrated intelligence, his engagement with the curriculum was often selective, gravitating towards subjects that captured his imagination or aligned with his developing interests. Despite a sometimes mercurial academic performance, early signs of his distinctive literary inclination began to surface during these years. It was within the pages of school publications that his burgeoning talent for storytelling first found a public outlet. He contributed regularly to the Trapeze, the school newspaper, and the Tabula, the literary magazine of Oak Park and River Forest High School, and these early pieces, often short stories or descriptive sketches, provided a canvas for his observations and his emerging voice. His contributions to these publications were more than just assignments. They were explorations of narrative, character, and setting. He experimented with different styles, though even at this nascent stage there were hints of the directness and economy of language that would later become his hallmark. He wrote about local events, sports, and occasionally fictionalized accounts that drew upon his rich experiences in the Michigan wilderness. These early writings were formative, allowing him to practice the craft of putting words to paper and to see his thoughts take tangible form. The school environment, with its various clubs and activities, also offered opportunities for Ernest to engage with literature beyond the classroom. He participated in debating societies and developed a reputation among his peers for his storytelling abilities. His enthusiasm for reading was evident, absorbing works of adventure, history, and fiction that resonated with his own spirit of exploration. Teachers and fellow students recognized a certain spark, an unusual facility with language, even if its full power was yet to be harnessed. These years of early education in Oak Park were a period of quiet development. While the formal curriculum provided a framework, it was in the extracurricular literary endeavours that Ernest truly began to find his footing as a writer. The school newspapers and magazines served as his initial proving ground, allowing him to experiment, to refine his expression, and to cultivate the literary ambitions that would eventually guide the entire trajectory of his life. The foundational skills of narrative composition, learned and practiced within the confines of his hometown's educational system, were quietly being laid. As Ernest Hemingway progressed through his formative years, a quiet but potent ambition began to solidify within him. The structured, often predictable rhythm of life in Oak Park, while providing stability, also began to feel constricting. This yearning was not merely a youthful restlessness, it was a deeper desire for a life lived beyond the conventional boundaries he observed around him. The conservative values and suburban comfort of his upbringing, though deeply ingrained, increasingly seemed insufficient to contain the expansive vision he held for his own existence. His summers in Michigan, with their raw encounters with nature and the demanding skills of the outdoors, had offered him glimpses of a different kind of reality, one where individual action held immediate consequences and where character was forged through direct experience. These experiences instilled in him a profound appreciation for authenticity and a skepticism towards what he perceived as the artificialities of polite society. He began to equate true living with a departure from the familiar, a pursuit of the unfamiliar and the challenging. This nascent ambition was not yet clearly defined as a literary path, though his writing was certainly a part of it. Rather, it was a more fundamental aspiration, to live a life rich in action, to encounter the world firsthand, and to gather experiences that would provide a profound basis for understanding. He sought to test himself against external forces, to face danger, and to observe the raw complexities of human nature in extremis. This desire for direct engagement with life's profound moments would become a driving force behind many of his subsequent decisions. The intellectual curiosity that had manifested in his school writings now fused with a hunger for physical and emotional experience. He read widely, not just for pleasure, but for insight into how others had lived and encountered the world. Figures of adventure, exploration, and artistic daring captivated him, solidifying his belief that a life of significance required active participation, not passive observation. He wished to be a part of the unfolding narrative of the world, rather than merely a spectator. This burgeoning ambition manifested as a growing impatience with the perceived limitations of his surroundings. The comfortable routines of Oak Park, once a source of security, now seemed to represent a stagnation he was determined to avoid. He began to envision a future that was fluid, unpredictable, and filled with the kind of intense moments that only direct engagement with life could provide. This yearning for a life of action, for authentic experience, was a seed planted deep within him, destined to grow and significantly influence the path he would choose upon leaving the familiar confines of home. It was a silent but powerful declaration of independence, a precursor to the adventurous trajectory his life would soon take. In the autumn of 1917, after declining to attend college, Ernest Hemingway ventured beyond the familiar confines of Oak Park and Michigan, finding his way to Kansas City, Missouri. Here, at the age of 18, he secured his first professional writing position as a cub reporter for the Kansas City Star. This period, though brief, proved to be a profoundly formative experience, laying foundational elements for the distinctive prose style that would later define his literary output. The newsroom of the Kansas City Star was a demanding environment, and the newspaper itself possessed a renowned style guide. This guide, a set of strict journalistic principles, emphasized clarity, conciseness, and directness in reporting. Reporters were instructed to use short sentences, avoid flowery adjectives and adverbs, and focus on factual accuracy. The philosophy was to present information plainly, allowing the facts to speak for themselves, unembellished by authorial intrusion or emotional ornamentation. For a young writer with an already developing interest in efficiency of language, these guidelines served as a rigorous apprenticeship. Hemingway was required to strip away superfluous words, to distill complex events into their essential components, and to communicate with an economy of expression. He learned to observe keenly, to listen carefully, and to record precisely. The pressure of daily deadlines further sharpened these skills, demanding immediate clarity and impact. His assignments varied, ranging from police beats and hospital rounds to covering local events and human interest stories. These experiences exposed him to a broad spectrum of urban life, often its grittier aspects, far removed from the idealized natural world of his Michigan summers or the suburban tranquility of Oak Park. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of crime, poverty, and human suffering, observations that would later infuse his fiction with a sense of stark realism. The discipline imposed by the Kansas City Star's journalistic standards resonated deeply with Hemingway's own burgeoning aesthetic. He absorbed the lessons of direct prose, understanding that power could be found in understatement, and that omission could sometimes be more potent than explicit description. The newspaper's insistence on vigorous English and short, declarative sentences became an internal compass for his own writing. He learned to trust the strength of nouns and verbs and to approach storytelling with an almost surgical precision. And this period was not merely a job, it was a crucible in which his raw talent was refined. The tenets of the Kansas City Star's style guide, accuracy, brevity, and clarity, became ingrained principles, shaping the very architecture of his sentences. It was here, in the bustling newsroom, that the seeds of his iconic, sparse, and impactful prose were truly nurtured, preparing him, perhaps unknowingly, for the literary path he was destined to forge. As Ernest Hemingway honed his craft in the newsroom of the Kansas City Star, the world beyond America's borders was already engulfed in an unprecedented conflagration. The Great War, as it was then known, had begun in Europe in the summer of 1914. Its origins were complex, rooted in a tangled web of interlocking alliances, imperial ambitions, and long-standing rivalries among the continent's major powers. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo had served as the immediate catalyst, but beneath this single event lay decades of escalating tensions. Initially, the United States maintained a stance of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson sought to keep America out of the European conflict, adhering to a policy of isolationism that had long characterized American foreign relations. However, as the war progressed, this neutrality became increasingly difficult to sustain. German submarine warfare, particularly the unrestricted sinking of merchant ships, including those carrying American citizens, began to shift public opinion. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, with the loss of over 100 American lives, was a pivotal moment, though it did not immediately draw the US into the fighting. Yet the drumbeat of war grew louder. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted in early 1917, revealed a German proposal to Mexico for an alliance against the United States, further inflaming American sentiment. By April of that year, the United States formally declared war on Germany, committing its industrial might and its young men to the Allied cause. For Ernest Hemingway, born in 1899, the outbreak of the war meant that by the time America entered the conflict, he was approaching the age of military eligibility. This global upheaval would dramatically alter the trajectories of countless lives, and his would be no exception. The war was not a distant abstraction, but a looming reality that promised to reshape the social, political, and personal landscapes for an entire generation. Young men across America, including those like Hemingway who sought experience and adventure, felt an increasing pull towards the battlefields of Europe. The conflict presented itself as a profound test of courage and a chance for direct engagement with the most significant historical event of their time. The innocent worldview of the early 20th century was swiftly giving way to a more somber and complex understanding of human nature and geopolitical forces. The quiet lives many had anticipated were now irrevocably bound to the vast destructive machinery of global conflict. With America's entry into the Great War, Ernest Hemingway, then barely 18 years old, found himself in a peculiar position. His eyesight, which he had always considered a minor inconvenience, proved to be a disqualifying factor for enlistment in the regular armed forces. The dream of direct combat, of participating in the grand narrative of the war, seemed to elude him. Yet, the desire for action, for direct experience, remained potent. This was a young man who had already chafed against the perceived confines of his upbringing and sought a life of intensity and authenticity. The war, for many of his generation, represented the ultimate test of these ideals. Hemingway, unwilling to be left behind, began to explore alternative avenues for participation. He learned of the various volunteer organizations that supported the war effort, particularly those operating on the European front lines. Among these, the American Red Cross Ambulance Corps presented a viable path. It offered a means to get to Europe, to be near the action, and to contribute to the immense human endeavour unfolding across the Atlantic. It was not the front-line combat he might have initially envisioned, but it was a direct engagement with the war's grim realities. His decision to join the ambulance corps was driven by a complex mix of motivations. There was the prevalent patriotic fervour of the time, certainly, but also a deeper, more personal yearning. This was a young man seeking to prove himself, to move beyond the comfortable boundaries of Oak Park and the structured environment of a newspaper office. He sought a life lived intensely, a life rich with experiences that would forge character and provide material for the stories he was already beginning to formulate in his mind. The Ambulance Corps offered a tangible opportunity for adventure, for a direct encounter with the world's harshness and heroism. Despite America's relatively recent entry into the war and the fact that he was joining a non-combatant service, Hemingway's eagerness was palpable. He was not alone in this sentiment. Many young Americans facing similar enlistment limitations or simply drawn to the humanitarian aspect volunteered for such roles. They were a generation poised on the cusp of profound change, and the war in all its forms represented an inescapable call. For Hemingway, this call manifested as a journey across the ocean, a decision that would indelibly mark the course of his life and profoundly influence the literary voice that would later emerge. He departed for Europe in May of 1918, heading towards an experience that would far exceed any prior imaginings. Upon arriving in Italy in June of 1918, Ernest Hemingway was assigned to the American Red Cross Ambulance Corps on the Italian front. This theatre of the Great War, often overshadowed by the Western Front, presented its own unique and formidable challenges. The landscape was rugged, dominated by mountains and rivers, making logistical support and troop movements exceptionally difficult. Hemingway found himself immersed in a world far removed from the manicured streets of Oak Park or the bustling newsroom of Kansas City. His initial duties involved transporting wounded Italian soldiers from the front lines to field hospitals. This work immediately exposed him to the grim aftermath of combat. He witnessed the profound physical suffering, the shock, and the quiet despair of men whose lives had been irrevocably altered by artillery shells and rifle fire. The abstract notion of war, cultivated through newspaper reports and patriotic rhetoric, gave way to the tangible reality of blood, pain, and the fragility of human existence. Despite the inherent dangers and the distressing nature of his work, Hemingway also experienced a profound sense of camaraderie among his fellow ambulance drivers and the Italian soldiers he encountered. In the face of shared peril, distinctions of background and nationality often blurred. There was a collective understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of extreme circumstances. This shared experience of adversity, of relying on one another in moments of great stress, would later become a recurring theme in his literary work. He observed the ways men conducted themselves under pressure, how they spoke, how they endured, and how they found moments of levity amidst the pervasive gloom. The conditions on the Italian front were harsh. The mountainous terrain meant often rudimentary roads, exposed positions, and unpredictable weather. Hemingway navigated these challenges, driving his ambulance through areas under intermittent shell fire, always aware of the constant threat. This direct, visceral engagement with the war's mechanics, the constant proximity to danger, served as a powerful, if brutal, education. It stripped away romantic notions and replaced them with a stark understanding of the war's indiscriminate nature. He was not a combatant in the traditional sense, but he was undeniably in the war. The sound of distant artillery, the sight of ruined villages, the ever-present ambulances filled with the injured, these impressions accumulated, shaping his perspective. His initial eagerness for action gradually matured into a deeper, more sombre comprehension of conflict's true cost. The Italian front became his crucible, an environment that would profoundly influence his developing worldview and the trajectory of his writing for decades to come. His time there was brief, but its impact was indelible. On the night of July 8, 1918, a defining moment in Ernest Hemingway's life unfolded near Fossalta di Piave, Italy. Having been distributing chocolate and cigarettes to Italian soldiers in the trenches, a seemingly innocuous act of comfort, he was caught in a sudden, brutal mortar attack. The quiet of the evening was shattered by the explosion of an Austrian trench mortar shell. The impact was immediate and devastating. Hemingway was severely wounded by fragments from the shell. Over 200 pieces of shrapnel tore into his legs, primarily his right knee and ankle. The force of the blast also left him concussed, momentarily disoriented and dazed. In the chaotic aftermath, amidst the cries of wounded Italian soldiers, Hemingway, despite his own injuries, attempted to assist a severely wounded Italian. As he carried the man toward the first aid dugout, a machine gun opened fire, striking him in the knee once more. The extent of his injuries was significant. The shrapnel had caused deep lacerations and fractures, particularly to his right leg. The immediate pain was intense, a searing agony that would linger for years. He was transported to a field hospital, then eventually to a Red Cross hospital in Milan for extensive treatment. This long period of recovery would involve numerous surgeries and a prolonged convalescence. Beyond the immediate physical trauma, the psychological impact of this event was profound and far-reaching. The suddenness of the attack, the proximity of death, and the experience of severe wounding left an indelible mark. It was an abrupt confrontation with his own mortality, a stark realization of the arbitrary nature of fate in wartime. This personal encounter with violence, suffering, and survival became a central pillar of his experience. This incident transformed him from an observer of war's effects into a direct participant in its suffering. He had sought out intense experience, and in this moment he received it in its most raw and unforgiving form. The wound became more than a physical injury. It was a symbol, a badge of experience that would inform his perspective on courage, pain, and the resilience of the human spirit. It instilled in him a deeper understanding of the grace under pressure that he would later articulate in his writing. The long hours of recovery in the hospital provided ample time for reflection, for processing the sensory overload of the front, and for internalizing the lessons of his near-fatal encounter. This moment of being shattered and then slowly pieced back together served as a powerful genesis for much of the literary output that would follow. It was a defining milestone, marking the transition from an eager young volunteer to a man deeply scarred, both physically and psychologically, by the crucible of war. Following his severe wounding, Ernest Hemingway was transferred to the American Red Cross Hospital in Milan, Italy. This period marked a significant chapter of his young life, not only for the physical recovery it entailed, but for the emotional landscape that unfolded within the hospital's quiet halls. The environment was one of healing, but also of introspection, a stark contrast to the front lines he had recently left. His injuries required multiple surgical procedures, including the removal of numerous shrapnel fragments and a lengthy rehabilitation. It was during this time of vulnerability and convalescence that he encountered Agnes von Kurowski. She was an American nurse, 7 years his senior, working diligently to care for the wounded soldiers. Agnes was a woman of calm demeanour, competence, and a comforting presence, qualities that deeply appealed to the young, recovering Hemingway. A bond began to form between the patient and the nurse, evolving from professional care into a profound emotional attachment. Hemingway, still only 18 years old, found himself deeply enamoured. Agnes represented a mature and sophisticated figure, offering solace and affection in a period of great physical and emotional need. Their relationship blossomed within the confines of the hospital, an intense and sheltered romance that provided a sense of normalcy and hope amidst the ongoing conflict. They exchanged letters and spent hours together, fostering a connection that to Hemingway felt deeply significant and potentially enduring. As Hemingway's physical condition improved, the prospect of his return to America became imminent, as he harboured a strong belief that Agnes would follow him, that their relationship would continue beyond the hospital walls and the war. This belief fueled his dreams for their future together. However, Agnes, a more experienced woman, understood the complexities and uncertainties that lay ahead. She had witnessed many such intense hospital romances, often ephemeral, born of the unique circumstances of war and recovery. The eventual separation was a source of profound heartbreak for Hemingway. Upon his departure from Italy, Agnes remained behind, continuing her nursing duties. She later wrote to him, ending their engagement and revealing her intention to marry an Italian officer. This rejection, delivered through a letter, deeply wounded Hemingway. It was a significant emotional blow, a disillusionment that echoed the broader sense of loss and betrayal many felt in the aftermath of the war. This intensely personal experience with love, hope, and subsequent heartbreak became a foundational element for one of his most celebrated novels, A Farewell to Arms. The character of Catherine Barclay, a British nurse, and her relationship with Frederick Henry, an American ambulance driver, are widely understood to be drawn directly from Hemingway's time with Agnes von Kurowski in Milan. The novel masterfully explores themes of love, war, loss, and the difficulty of finding enduring connection amidst chaos, reflecting the deep impression Agnes left upon his psyche and his burgeoning literary imagination. In early 1919, Ernest Hemingway returned to the familiar tree-lined streets of Oak Park, Illinois. His homecoming was met with the understandable pride of his family and community, who viewed him as a war hero. He carried the physical scars of his wounds, still healing, and the psychological weight of experiences far beyond the comprehension of most of those around him. The young man who had left for Europe in search of adventure had indeed found it, but the cost was a profound transformation of his inner world. The quiet, ordered existence of Oak Park, which once seemed a natural backdrop to his youth, now felt profoundly alien. The conservative values and predictable routines of his childhood home offered little comfort or resonance. He'd witnessed the stark realities of human suffering and courage, the arbitrary nature of death, and the intense camaraderie forged in the crucible of war. These experiences had aged him beyond his 19 years, creating a chasm between his inner landscape and the placid suburban environment. Hemingway found it difficult to articulate the depth of what he had endured. The language of his pre-war life seemed inadequate to convey the visceral terror of the front, the quiet heroism of the wounded, or the bitter taste of lost love. This inability to fully communicate his experiences contributed to a growing sense of isolation. He felt disconnected from his peers, who had not faced similar trials, and from his family, who, despite their love, could not truly grasp the magnitude of his transformation. His physical recovery was gradual. He continued to experience pain from his leg wounds, and the emotional scars were deeper still. The disillusionment from the war, compounded by the heartbreak of his relationship with Agnes von Kurowski, settled within him. This period of readjustment was marked by restlessness and a certain emotional detachment. The conventional path of returning to school or settling into a career felt unappealing, even impossible, given the intensity of his recent past. The war had stripped away many of his youthful illusions, leaving him with a more cynical, yet also more keenly observant, perspective on life. This newfound clarity, forged in the crucible of trauma, would profoundly influence his literary sensibilities. He began to perceive the world with a starker realism, valuing directness, authenticity, and the unspoken truths that often lie beneath the surface of polite society. His writing, even in these early stages, began to reflect this change. The concise and unadorned prose style he had developed at the Kansas City Star now had a deeper well of experience from which to draw. He sought to capture the essence of human experience with precision, to convey emotion through understatement, and to explore the themes of courage, resilience, and the fragility of life. The returned Hemingway was no longer merely a young man seeking adventure. He was a nascent artist, profoundly shaped by war, grappling with its aftermath, and beginning to find his voice in its echoes. As Ernest Hemingway navigated his return to civilian life, America itself was undergoing a profound transformation. The years immediately following the Great War, often termed the Roaring Twenties, were a period of unprecedented social and cultural upheaval. The nation, having emerged victorious but weary from the European conflict, sought to cast off the strictures of the past and embrace a new era of prosperity and liberation. Technological advancements such as the widespread adoption of automobiles and radios began to reshape daily life, fostering a sense of modernity and interconnectedness. Urban centres pulsed with a new energy, drawing people from rural areas and creating vibrant, diverse communities. Women, having played crucial roles in the wartime economy, pushed for greater independence, challenging traditional gender roles through fashion, lifestyle, and a more assertive presence in public life. This era was perhaps most famously characterized by the Jazz Age. The syncopated rhythms and improvisational spirit of jazz music became the soundtrack to a generation eager for excitement and self-expression. Speakeasies, hidden behind unassuming storefronts, thrived under the shadow of prohibition which had been enacted in 1920. The ban on alcohol, intended to uplift societal morals, instead inadvertently fueled a culture of clandestine revelry and a casual disregard for authority, further eroding traditional values. Beneath the surface of this exuberant facade, however, lay a deep current of disillusionment. For many who had experienced the horrors of the war, the pre-war ideals of patriotism, honour, and progress seemed hollow. They had witnessed the senseless destruction and the brutal realities of combat, which often bore little resemblance to the romanticised narratives of heroism. This profound sense of betrayal and loss of innocence gave rise to a generation of writers and artists who felt alienated from the established order. Gertrude Stein famously coined the term "lost generation" to describe these individuals, many of whom were American expatriates living in Europe. They were lost not in the sense of being directionless, but rather in their detachment from the conventional values and institutions that seemed to have failed them. They questioned authority, challenged societal norms, and sought to find meaning in a world that felt fundamentally altered and often absurd. Ernest Hemingway, with his direct experience of the war's brutality and his subsequent personal disillusionment, was a quintessential member of this generation. He instinctively understood their anxieties and their search for authentic experience in a world that seemed to lack it. The energetic yet underlyingly cynical spirit of the Roaring Twenties, coupled with the existential questioning of the lost generation, would provide a rich, complex backdrop for his emerging literary voice and would profoundly influence the themes he explored in his earliest, most impactful works. The restless spirit that animated Ernest Hemingway after his return from the war, combined with his burgeoning literary ambitions, soon led him beyond the familiar confines of Oak Park. In 1920, he found a new professional home with the Toronto Star, a prominent Canadian newspaper. His initial role involved writing features for the Star Weekly, a Saturday magazine supplement, and later more direct reporting for the daily paper. This engagement offered him a consistent platform for his writing, allowing him to further refine the concise, direct style he had begun to cultivate during his time in Kansas City. His articles for the Toronto Star covered a wide range of topics, from fishing and camping trips in the Canadian wilderness, echoing his beloved Michigan summers, to observations on everyday life and social commentary. These pieces, while journalistic in nature, often bore the subtle imprint of his emerging literary voice, characterized by an economy of language and a keen eye for detail. The work provided a practical outlet for his creative energy and a steady income, a necessary foundation for his aspirations. However, the true turning point in his association with the Toronto Star came in 1921, when he was offered a position as a foreign correspondent. This opportunity was precisely what Hemingway, eager to escape the perceived stagnation of post-war America and immerse himself in the vibrant cultural ferment of Europe, had been seeking. It offered the chance to live abroad, to travel extensively, and to observe the world from a new vantage point, all while being paid to write. In September of 1921, Hemingway, now married to Hadley Richardson, whom he had met in Chicago, embarked on a new chapter of his life. They moved to Paris, a city that had become a magnet for artists, writers, and intellectuals from around the globe. For the Toronto Star, Hemingway covered a vast array of subjects, from international conferences and political unrest to bullfights in Spain and skiing in the Alps. His assignments took him across Europe, to Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and Turkey, providing him with an unparalleled education in the complexities of the post-war world. These experiences as a foreign correspondent were invaluable. They sharpened his observational skills, broadened his understanding of diverse cultures, and exposed him to a multitude of human experiences. He learned to distill complex events into clear, compelling prose, a skill that would prove essential to his fiction. The constant travel, the pressure of deadlines, and the necessity of capturing the essence of a place or an event in a few carefully chosen words further honed his craft. This period was not merely a journalistic interlude, it was a crucial apprenticeship, allowing him to gather the rich material and develop the narrative techniques that would soon define his literary legacy. For many American writers and artists of the 1920s, Paris was more than just a city. It was a beacon, a sanctuary, and a crucible. Following the Great War, a profound sense of disillusionment settled over a generation that had witnessed unprecedented destruction and questioned established values. The rapid industrialization and moral conservatism of America, particularly during the Prohibition era, felt stifling to those seeking intellectual freedom and artistic expression. Paris, by contrast, offered a liberating atmosphere, a vibrant cultural landscape, and an affordability that allowed aspiring creatives to pursue their craft without constant financial strain. The exchange rate between the dollar and the franc made living in the French capital remarkably inexpensive for Americans, allowing them to reside comfortably, frequent cafes, and immerse themselves in the city's rich offerings with modest means. This economic advantage, combined with a deep-seated European tradition of valuing the arts, created an irresistible draw. Paris had long been a centre of artistic innovation, and in the aftermath of the war, it became the undisputed capital of modernism, a movement that sought to break from traditional forms and explore new ways of seeing and representing the world. Hemingway arrived in Paris in 1921, joining a burgeoning community of expatriates, many of whom would become central figures in 20th century literature and art. The city pulsed with an intellectual and artistic energy unlike anywhere else. Cafes along the Boulevard Saint-Germain and in Montparnasse served as informal salons, where ideas were debated, manifestos were forged and friendships were kindled. Salons hosted by figures like Gertrude Stein became crucial gathering places, thus offering a space for these nascent talents to connect, critique, and inspire one another. The presence of literary giants like Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and Gertrude Stein provided both mentorship and a high standard of artistic ambition. For a young writer like Hemingway, eager to shed the conventions of traditional prose and forge a distinctive voice, this environment was profoundly stimulating. He could absorb the lessons of the modernists, experiment with new narrative techniques, and receive direct feedback from established masters. The city itself, with its ancient streets, its grand boulevards, its artistic heritage, and its bohemian corners, served as a constant source of inspiration and observation. Paris, therefore, was not merely a backdrop for Hemingway's early career, it was an active participant in his artistic development. It offered the freedom, the community, and the intellectual rigour necessary for him to transition from a journalist to a serious literary artist, absorbing the lessons of modernism while charting his own unique course in the creation of a new American prose. Amidst the shifting landscape of his early 20s, and before his departure for Paris, Ernest Hemingway encountered Hadley Richardson, a woman who would become his first wife and a foundational figure in his early literary journey. Hadley was 8 years his senior, a quiet, gentle soul from St. Louis, Missouri, with a background in music. She possessed a calm demeanour that contrasted with Hemingway's more restless and ambitious nature. Their meeting in 1920, introduced by Hemingway's sister, marked the beginning of a relationship that provided stability and encouragement during a crucial period of his life. Their courtship was relatively brief, yet filled with a shared sense of purpose and a mutual understanding of the aspirations that drove Ernest. Hadley, having inherited a modest sum, provided a degree of financial security that allowed Hemingway to pursue his writing with greater dedication than might otherwise have been possible. This financial independence was a practical enabler of their shared dream, to live abroad in Europe, where Ernest could fully immerse himself in the craft of writing, free from the constraints of conventional employment. They married in September 1921, just weeks before embarking on their journey across the Atlantic. Hadley's quiet strength and unwavering belief in Ernest's talent were vital to him. She did not seek the spotlight, but rather embraced a supportive role, creating a domestic environment that fostered his creative work. In the often chaotic and demanding life of an aspiring writer in a foreign city, her presence offered a grounding influence. She managed their modest household, navigated the challenges of living in a new country, and provided the emotional anchor that Hemingway often required. Her encouragement extended beyond mere domestic support. Hadley was his first and most attentive audience, reading his early drafts, offering gentle feedback, and celebrating his small victories. She understood his fervent dedication to writing and tolerated the long hours he spent at his desk, often late into the night. This period in Paris, with Hadley by his side, allowed Hemingway to fully commit to his literary apprenticeship developing his unique prose style and beginning the foundational work that would eventually lead to his first published stories and novels. Their early life together in Paris, characterized by shared adventure and quiet devotion, laid a crucial groundwork for the literary achievements that were to come, with Hadley serving as a steadfast companion and an essential source of stability. In the vibrant literary landscape of 1920s, Paris, one of the most influential figures for Ernest Hemingway, and indeed for many aspiring American expatriate writers, was Gertrude Stein. Her apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus became a renowned salon, a gathering place where artists, writers, and intellectuals convened to discuss art, literature, and the changing world. It was a space where ideas were exchanged freely and where burgeoning talents could find encouragement, critique, and connection. Hemingway was introduced to Stein in 1922, and their relationship quickly evolved into a significant mentorship. Stein, an established writer and art collector, possessed a sharp intellect and an unconventional approach to language. She recognized a raw talent in Hemingway and took him under her wing, offering critical feedback on his early manuscripts. Her influence was subtle yet profound, encouraging him to strip away unnecessary ornamentation from his prose and to focus on directness and precision. She advocated for a style that conveyed meaning through simplicity, a philosophy that resonated deeply with Hemingway's own emerging aesthetic. Yet it was Gertrude Stein who famously coined the phrase "lost generation." The story goes that she overheard a garage owner complain about a young mechanic who had served in the war, saying, "You are all a generation perdue." Stein then applied this observation to the generation of young Americans who had come of age during or immediately after the First World War. These individuals, she posited, had been profoundly disillusioned by the immense trauma of the war and the subsequent societal shifts. They felt a sense of alienation and a questioning of traditional values, leading them to seek meaning and purpose outside the conventional structures of their home country. For Hemingway, this label resonated deeply. He, along with many of his contemporaries like F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos, embodied the characteristics of this lost generation. They were young, often restless, and sought escape from what they perceived as the spiritual emptiness of post-war America. Paris offered them a sanctuary, a place where they could reconcile their experiences, explore new forms of artistic expression, and attempt to forge new identities in a world fundamentally altered by conflict. Stein's pronouncement provided a collective identity and a framework for understanding the shared experience of these expatriate writers, solidifying their place in literary history and capturing the prevailing sentiment of an era. Beyond the salon of Gertrude Stein, another formidable literary figure in Paris who exerted significant influence on Ernest Hemingway was Ezra Pound. Pound, an American expatriate poet and critic, was a central architect of modernism, known for his radical ideas about language, form, and the role of the artist. He possessed an almost evangelical zeal for promoting new talent and a rigorous standard for literary craftsmanship. Hemingway first encountered Pound in 1922, not long after arriving in Paris. Their initial interactions were formal, but Pound quickly recognized the potential in the young writer. Despite Pound's often eccentric demeanor and complex poetic theories, he offered practical and invaluable guidance to Hemingway. Pound's mentorship was less about social gatherings and more about intense, focused discussions on the mechanics of writing. He emphasized clarity, economy of language, and the importance of precise observation. His advice often revolved around stripping away unnecessary words, a concept he had championed in his own poetic manifestos. He encouraged Hemingway to make it new, to find fresh ways to express old truths, and to challenge conventional narrative structures. Pound also played a crucial role in connecting Hemingway with other prominent figures within the Parisian literary scene. His network was vast, extending to editors, publishers, and influential writers across Europe and America. He introduced Hemingway to T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Sylvia Beach, the proprietor of the legendary Shakespeare and Company bookstore. These introductions were vital for a young, relatively unknown writer, opening doors to publishing opportunities and exposing him to the cutting edge of contemporary literature. Pound actively championed Hemingway's work, using his own considerable influence to advocate for its publication. The relationship between Hemingway and Pound was characterized by a mutual respect, though not without the occasional tension inherent in any mentorship between strong personalities. Pound saw in Hemingway a writer capable of embodying the modernist ideals of directness and authenticity, while Hemingway, in turn, benefited immensely from Pound's critical eye and his tireless efforts to support promising artists. Pound's practical advice on prose, coupled with his expansive connections, provided a crucial stepping stone for Hemingway, helping him to refine his distinctive voice and gain recognition in the competitive literary world of the 1920s. His guidance was instrumental in shaping the emerging style that would soon define Hemingway's early masterpieces. Amidst the bustling intellectual landscape of 1920s Paris, a particular establishment stood as a quiet sanctuary and a vibrant nexus for the English-speaking literary community: Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company. Located originally on the Rue du Puy-Trin and later on the Rue de l'Odéon, this unassuming bookstore was far more than a simple purveyor of books. It was a cultural institution, a haven, and a vital lifeline for many aspiring and established writers, including Ernest Hemingway. Sylvia Beach, an American expatriate herself, opened Shakespeare and Company in 1919. Her vision was to create a space that fostered intellectual exchange and provided access to literature that was often difficult to find elsewhere. The shop's interior was modest, filled with shelves overflowing with books, comfortable chairs, and a welcoming atmosphere that encouraged lingering and conversation. It quickly became a second home for many of the lost generation writers who flocked to Paris in search of artistic freedom and inspiration. For Hemingway, as for many others, Shakespeare and Company served several crucial functions. Foremost, it operated as a lending library, offering an invaluable resource to writers who often lived on meagre budgets. Access to a wide array of contemporary and classic literature was essential for their craft, and Beach's extensive collection provided just that. Hemingway frequently borrowed books, immersing himself in the works of his contemporaries and the literary masters who preceded them, absorbing influences and honing his own developing style. Beyond its role as a library, Shakespeare and Company was a quintessential meeting place. It was a place where writers could gather, exchange ideas, and forge connections. Intellectual discussions often unfolded amidst the shelves, covering topics from literary theory to current events. It was not uncommon to find figures like James Joyce, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and T.S. Eliot passing through its doors, engaging in spirited debates or simply enjoying the quiet companionship of fellow artists. Sylvia Beach herself was a warm and generous host, often providing tea, a listening ear, and sometimes even financial assistance to struggling writers. Her most famous act of literary patronage was undoubtedly the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922, a work deemed obscene and banned in both the United States and the United Kingdom. This courageous act cemented Shakespeare and Company's reputation as a daring and indispensable force in modern literature. For Hemingway, the bookstore was a constant presence during his formative years in Paris, a place of comfort, intellectual nourishment, and a tangible link to the vibrant, interconnected world of expatriate literature that profoundly shaped his early career. The early years in Paris were a crucible for Ernest Hemingway's literary development, a period where influences from mentors and the vibrant expatriate scene converged to shape his distinctive voice. It was during this time that his nascent talent began to coalesce into the concise, impactful prose that would soon define his work. The publication of his early short stories marked a significant turning point, and offering the first clear glimpse of the style and thematic preoccupations that would characterize his career. His initial collection, 3 stories and 10 poems, published in 1923, provided an early, though limited, introduction to his emerging style. However, it was with the release of In Our Time in 1924 by the Paris-based Three Mountains Press, followed by an expanded American edition in 1925, that Hemingway truly announced his presence. This collection was not merely a compilation of narratives, it was a deliberate exercise in a new form of storytelling, showcasing a radical departure from the verbose literary traditions of the past. The stories within In Our Time were characterized by their stark simplicity and understated emotional power. Hemingway's prose was lean, stripped of embellishment, and focused on direct observation. He employed short, declarative sentences, a clear, unadorned vocabulary, and a remarkable ability to convey profound meaning through implication rather than explicit statement. This style, often referred to as the iceberg theory, suggested that much of the story's depth lay beneath the surface, implied by what was left unsaid. The reader was invited to infer the characters' inner lives and the broader implications of their experiences from their actions and dialogue, rather than through authorial exposition. Thematically, In Our Time explored many of the concerns that haunted the lost generation. Stories such as Indian Camp, The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, and the Nick Adams stories, which trace the maturation of a young man against the backdrop of rural Michigan, delved into themes of war, trauma, disillusionment, violence, and the difficult transition from innocence to experience. The vignettes interspersed throughout the collection, often brutal and unflinching depictions of bullfighting and wartime atrocities, served as stark counterpoints to the more reflective narratives, further emphasizing the harsh realities of the modern world. Critically, In Our Time received considerable attention, particularly from influential figures within the literary avant-garde. Ezra Pound praised its freshness, and Gertrude Stein recognized the originality of its voice. The critical reception acknowledged the emergence of a powerful new talent, one who was pushing the boundaries of prose fiction. While not universally acclaimed at first, the collection firmly established Hemingway as a significant voice, one whose unique style and unflinching portrayal of life resonated deeply with a generation grappling with the aftermath of profound global upheaval. Following the foundational work of In Our Time, Ernest Hemingway embarked on a more ambitious project, one that would solidify his reputation and articulate the collective voice of a generation. The novel, The Sun Also Rises, emerged from his experiences and observations within the expatriate community in Paris and during a trip to Pamplona, Spain, in 1925. This journey, shared with a group of friends including his first wife Hadley and various colourful personalities, provided the direct inspiration for the characters and events that would populate his first major novel. The writing process for The Sun Also Rises was remarkably swift. Hemingway began the manuscript in July 1925, and shortly after the Pamplona trip, and completed a draft by September of the same year. He then undertook significant revisions, honing the prose and refining the narrative arc, a process that continued into the early months of 1926. The urgency and immediacy of the narrative reflect the intense period of creation and the direct autobiographical roots of the story. Published in October 1926, The Sun Also Rises immediately resonated with readers and critics. It became an instant touchstone for understanding the lost generation, a term popularized by Gertrude Stein and vividly brought to life by Hemingway's characters. The novel centers on a group of American and British expatriates living in Paris, their lives marked by aimlessness, moral ambiguity, and a profound sense of disillusionment in the aftermath of World War I. At the heart of the narrative is Jake Barnes, an American journalist rendered impotent by a war wound, and Lady Brett Ashley, a fiercely independent and sexually liberated Englishwoman. Their unconsummated love affair forms the emotional core of the novel, symbolizing the deeper wounds and emotional incapacities that plague their generation. Jake's physical wound serves as a potent metaphor for the spiritual and psychological damage inflicted upon those who survived the war, leaving them unable to form traditional relationships or find solace in conventional societal structures. The characters drift through Parisian cafes, engage in casual romances, and seek escape in the bullfights and fishing trips of Spain. Their relentless pursuit of pleasure often leads to emptiness, highlighting a pervasive sense of ennui and a search for authentic experience that frequently eludes them. The novel explores themes of lost love, the corrosive effects of trauma, the superficiality of modern life, and the struggle to find meaning in a world where old values have crumbled. Yet, amidst the cynicism, there is also a quiet dignity in Jake's stoicism and a yearning for something more substantial. The Sun Also Rises was a major literary milestone, not only for Hemingway but for American literature as a whole. It captured the zeitgeist of the era with startling accuracy and introduced a new kind of hero, or anti-hero, who navigated a broken world with a quiet resilience. The novel's spare, direct prose, already refined in Our Time, reached a new level of sophistication, demonstrating Hemingway's mastery of conveying complex emotions and profound observations through seemingly simple language. It cemented his reputation as a vital and powerful voice, one that spoke directly to the anxieties and aspirations of his time. As Ernest Hemingway's literary star ascended with the success of The Sun Also Rises, his personal life began to undergo a significant transformation. Into this evolving landscape stepped Pauline Pfeiffer, a woman who would profoundly alter the trajectory of his relationships and domestic arrangements. Pauline was a fashion journalist, working for Vogue magazine in Paris, and she moved within the same vibrant expatriate circles as Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley Richardson. Pauline was introduced to the Hemingways through mutual friends in 1926. Initially, suprammed, she became a close companion to Hadley, sharing interests and spending considerable time together. This friendship provided a natural entry point into the Hemingway household, and for a period, Pauline was a frequent and welcome presence in their lives. She was known for her intelligence, her wit, and her stylish sophistication, qualities that undoubtedly appealed to Hemingway. However, the nature of Pauline's relationship with Ernest soon shifted beyond mere friendship. A subtle, then increasingly overt romantic attachment began to develop between them. This burgeoning connection introduced a profound complexity into the seemingly stable structure of Ernest and Hadley's marriage. The dynamic became increasingly strained, characterized by unspoken tensions and a growing sense of unease within the household. Hadley, a woman of gentle disposition, found herself in an increasingly difficult position. The emotional entanglement between her husband and her friend created an atmosphere of discomfort and eventual heartbreak. The bohemian ideals of the Parisian expatriate community, which often embraced open relationships and unconventional arrangements, were put to a severe test by this personal drama. The situation escalated over several months. The emotional toll on Hadley was considerable, as she grappled with the reality of her husband's deepening affection for Pauline. Despite attempts at reconciliation or a return to their earlier, simpler life, the bond between Ernest and Pauline proved too strong to be easily dismissed. The intricate dance of their affections unfolded against the backdrop of their shared literary and social world. Ultimately, the strain became insurmountable. The breakdown of Ernest and Hadley's marriage was a painful and protracted affair, culminating in their divorce in January 1927. This decision marked the end of a significant chapter in Hemingway's life, one that had seen him transform from an aspiring writer into a celebrated literary figure. The dissolution of this first marriage, which had provided him with stability and support during his formative years in Paris, was a direct consequence of his developing relationship with Pauline Pfeiffer. The romance with Pauline, therefore, did not merely introduce a new partner into Hemingway's life, it fundamentally reshaped his personal world, setting the stage for his next marriage and a new phase of his existence. The unravelling of Ernest Hemingway's first marriage to Hadley Richardson was a period marked by considerable personal turmoil for all involved. The process of divorce, while legally straightforward, was emotionally complex and left an indelible mark on Hemingway. Hadley, despite the pain, conducted herself with dignity, seeking to navigate the difficult circumstances with as much grace as possible. The settlement involved a significant portion of Hemingway's future royalties from The Sun Also Rises, a testament to Hadley's earlier support and belief in his work. This financial arrangement underscored the profound contribution Hadley had made to his early career, enabling him to write and pursue his literary ambitions during their years in Paris. The divorce was finalised in January of 1927. Shortly thereafter, in May of the same year, Ernest Hemingway married Pauline Pfeiffer. The wedding took place in Paris, a city that had witnessed the beginning and end of his first marriage, and now the commencement of his second. Pauline, a woman of means and sophistication, brought a different kind of stability to Hemingway's life. Her family, particularly her uncle, provided financial assistance that allowed Hemingway to focus more intently on his writing, free from some of the immediate economic pressures he had previously faced. However, this transition was not without its inherent challenges. The emotional complexities of leaving Hadley for Pauline lingered, creating an undercurrent of guilt and self-reproach for Hemingway. His relationships with many of his friends within the expatriate community were also strained by the divorce. Some felt that he had treated Hadley unfairly, and the social dynamics shifted. Gertrude Stein, a significant mentor, famously expressed her disapproval, leading to a cooling of their once close friendship. The early years of Hemingway's marriage to Pauline were characterized by a blend of newfound domesticity and continued literary ambition. Pauline, like Hadley, was supportive of his work, and her practical nature complemented his artistic temperament. They soon left Paris, eventually settling in Key West, Florida, a move that signaled a departure from the European expatriate life that had so defined his 20s. Despite the apparent new beginning, the personal conflicts inherent in this transition remained. Hemingway carried with him the emotional baggage of his first marriage's dissolution, a theme that would subtly, and sometimes overtly, surface in his later works. The transition from one relationship to another, particularly under such circumstances, is rarely seamless, and for a man of Hemingway's intense emotional landscape, it was a period of both forward momentum and internal reckoning. His second marriage brought new opportunities and a different kind of companionship, but it also cemented a pattern of personal choices that would continue to shape his life. Following his second marriage and the move away from Paris, Ernest Hemingway dedicated himself to a new novel, one that would deeply revisit the trauma and romance of his wartime experiences. This work would become A Farewell to Arms, a story imbued with the stark realities of combat and the tender, yet ultimately tragic nature of love amidst profound upheaval. The writing process for this novel was intense, demanding and meticulous, reflecting Hemingway's evolving mastery of his craft. He sought to capture the essence of a particular historical moment, while exploring universal themes of human vulnerability and resilience. A Farewell to Arms was published in 1929, marking another significant literary achievement for Hemingway. The novel tells the story of Frederick Henry, an American ambulance driver serving with the Italian army during the First World War, and his love affair with Catherine Barclay, a British nurse. The narrative unfolds against the backdrop of the brutal Italian front, detailing the chaos, the camaraderie, and the profound disillusionment that war inflicted upon its participants. Hemingway's prose, by this point, had reached a new level of maturity, stripped bare of excess, yet resonant with emotional depth. The themes central to A Farewell to Arms are deeply rooted in Hemingway's own life. The novel explores the devastating impact of war, not merely through physical wounds, but through its erosion of innocence and belief. Frederick Henry's growing cynicism and eventual desertion from the army reflect a broader disillusionment with grand causes and institutions, a sentiment that Hemingway himself had come to share after his experiences. The depiction of the Italian retreat from Caporetto, a harrowing and chaotic sequence, was drawn directly from Hemingway's own observations and participation in that historical event. Perhaps most poignantly, the love story between Frederick and Catherine mirrors, in many respects, Hemingway's own relationship with Agnes von Kurowski. The passionate yet ultimately doomed nature of their romance on the Italian front found a fictional parallel in the novel. The tenderness, the shared vulnerability, and the tragic separation due to circumstances beyond their control in A Farewell to Arms echoed the profound impact Agnes had on the young Hemingway. The novel's exploration of love as a fragile refuge in a world shattered by conflict resonated deeply with readers, many of whom had also lived through, or were still grappling with, the aftermath of the Great War. The tragic ending, where Catherine dies in childbirth and Frederick is left alone, underscored the novel's overarching message about loss and the fragility of human connection in the face of overwhelming forces. It was a meditation on the idea that even the purest love can be crushed by the indifference of the universe and the brutality of war. A Farewell to Arms cemented Hemingway's reputation not only as a master stylist, but also as a profound chronicler of the human condition, particularly in moments of extreme pressure and sorrow. With A Farewell to Arms published and critical acclaim once again secured, Ernest Hemingway and Pauline Pfeiffer embarked on a new chapter, establishing a home in Key West, Florida. This move, initiated in the late 1920s and solidifying in the early 1930s, marked a significant shift from the intellectual fervour of Paris and the family ties of Pauline's Arkansas origins. Key West offered a distinct atmosphere, a blend of remote island charm and a certain rugged individualism that appealed deeply to Hemingway's sensibility. Their initial residence was a modest rental, but it was not long before Pauline's wealthy uncle, Gus, purchased a grander property for them, a beautiful 19th-century Spanish colonial-style house on Whitehead Street. This substantial home, with its thick stone walls, deep verandas and lush tropical gardens, would become a central fixture in Hemingway's life for over a decade. It was a place of both domesticity and intense creative labour, a sanctuary where he could focus on his writing away from the constant distractions and demands of his earlier European life. The Key West environment itself proved to be a powerful catalyst for Hemingway's work. The island's unique character, with its vibrant fishing culture, its relaxed pace, and its proximity to the open sea, resonated profoundly with his evolving interests. He embraced the local lifestyle, spending countless hours fishing in the Gulf Stream, exploring the surrounding waters, and engaging with the diverse array of characters who inhabited the small island community. These experiences, steeped in the natural world and the rhythms of a life connected to the ocean, would permeate much of his subsequent writing. Pauline, with her practical nature and a deep understanding of Hemingway's need for an uninterrupted workspace, played a crucial role in establishing this new creative hub. She meticulously managed the household, creating an environment conducive to his demanding routine. Hemingway's writing studio, located in a separate building on the property, was his domain, a place of quiet concentration where he would rise early each morning to work. This disciplined approach, combined with the inspiring surroundings, allowed him to produce a remarkable volume of work during his Key West years. The move to Key West represented more than just a change of address. It signified a new phase in Hemingway's life, both personally and creatively. It was a period of consolidation, of settling down, and of deepening his connection to themes of nature, sport, and the elemental struggles of existence. The island, with its unique blend of isolation and vibrant life, provided the ideal backdrop for this era of significant literary production. As Ernest Hemingway's literary star continued its ascent, a parallel phenomenon began to take shape, the development of his public persona eventually crystallizing into the familiar figure known as Papa. This image, carefully cultivated and widely disseminated, became almost as famous as his prose itself, influencing both public perception and, at times, his own behaviour, while the transition to Key West provided a fertile ground for this transformation. Away from the intellectual salons of Paris, Hemingway increasingly embraced the life of an outdoorsman. His passion for deep-sea fishing, already significant, intensified in the waters surrounding Key West. Photographs began to circulate depicting him aboard his boat, the Pilar, battling marlin and tuna, his beard growing longer, his gaze direct and resolute. These images, often published alongside his articles and stories, presented a compelling narrative of a man deeply connected to nature, facing its challenges with stoicism and strength. He was often pictured in rugged attire, worn shirts, sturdy shorts, and a fisherman's cap, projecting an air of practical masculinity. This visual representation reinforced the themes present in his fiction: courage in the face of adversity, the dignity of struggle, and an almost primal engagement with the natural world. The public, captivated by his powerful prose, found a tangible, heroic figure in the author himself. The moniker Papa gradually emerged from this growing celebrity. Initially, it may have been an affectionate nickname among close friends and family, reflecting a certain gravitas or an older, mentoring quality. However, as his fame expanded, the name took on a broader, more iconic resonance. It suggested a patriarchal authority, a seasoned wisdom, and an almost mythical status. He was seen as a leader, a man who had lived intensely and understood the profound truths of existence. This public image was not merely a passive byproduct of his fame. Hemingway actively participated in its construction. He understood the power of myth-making and the appeal of a larger-than-life figure. His public appearances, his interviews, and even his private anecdotes often reinforced this carefully crafted persona. He embodied the ideals of masculinity and adventure that many of his readers admired, becoming a symbol of a particular kind of American ruggedness and independence. The impact of this persona on his celebrity was immense. It differentiated him from other literary figures, creating a unique brand that transcended the pages of his books. He became a cultural icon, representing not just a writer, but an entire way of life, a life lived fully, bravely, and authentically. This image, while powerful, also brought with it certain expectations and pressures, shaping how he was perceived and, perhaps how he perceived himself. Amidst the fishing excursions and the growing public image of Papa, Ernest Hemingway continued his rigorous literary output. One significant work from this period, published in 1932, was Death in the Afternoon, a non-fiction exploration of the Spanish bullfight. This book represented a deep dive into a subject that had fascinated him since his first exposure to it in Spain during the 1920s, an experience that had already subtly influenced The Sun Also Rises. Death in the Afternoon is not merely a descriptive account of bullfighting, it is a meticulous and philosophical treatise. Hemingway aimed to explain the ritual, its history, its technicalities, and its profound cultural significance to an audience largely unfamiliar with its nuances. He delved into the intricacies of the corrida, from the breeding of the bulls to the precise movements of the matadors, explaining the roles of each participant with painstaking detail. His prose, while factual, conveyed an underlying reverence for the spectacle. His fascination with bullfighting stemmed from several interwoven threads. At its core, he saw in the bullfight a heightened drama of life and death, stripped bare of artifice. It presented a primal confrontation between man and beast, demanding immense courage, skill, and an unflinching acceptance of mortality. For Hemingway, the corrida was an art form, a tragic ballet where beauty and brutality coexisted. He admired the matador's grace under pressure, the disciplined artistry required to face a dangerous animal, and the ultimate moment of truth, the faena, which culminated in the kill. Philosophically, Hemingway viewed bullfighting as an arena where essential human qualities were tested and revealed. It offered a profound meditation on courage, honour, and the nature of fear. The ritualistic nature of the event, with its strict rules and traditions, resonated with his own aesthetic principles of precision and clarity. He saw in the bullfight a purity of action, a place where sentimentality was banished, and the stark realities of existence were confronted directly. The book also served as a vehicle for Hemingway to articulate his broader artistic theories. He discussed the relationship between art and experience, the importance of accurate observation, and the necessity for a writer to confront difficult truths without flinching. He argued that the bullfight, in its raw intensity, provided a profound wellspring of human emotion and philosophical insight, much like great literature itself. Death in the Afternoon cemented Hemingway's reputation not only as a novelist, but also as a keen observer of culture and a profound thinker. It revealed his unwavering commitment to exploring the extremities of human experience and his belief in the inherent dignity found in facing life's ultimate challenges, even those culminating in death. The book, with its detailed explanations and philosophical underpinnings, invited readers to look beyond the surface violence and appreciate the deeper artistic and existential dimensions of the bullfight. Following his intricate examination of the bullfight, Ernest Hemingway sought new landscapes for both adventure and literary material. In 1933, he embarked on his first extensive safari to East Africa, accompanied by Pauline. This expedition was not merely a recreational trip, it was a deliberate immersion into a world of raw nature, demanding physical endurance and a keen sense of observation, elements that continually fueled his creative spirit. The African safari captivated Hemingway deeply. The vast untamed wilderness, the challenging pursuit of big game, and the close encounters with formidable animals provided a profound experience that resonated with his established themes of courage, skill, and the confrontation with mortality. He spent months traversing the plains and bush, tracking animals, and engaging in the demanding practice of hunting. This was an environment where the stakes were often high, and the distinctions between life and death were acutely present. From this journey emerged Green Hills of Africa, published in 1935. Unlike Death in the Afternoon, which was a more structured exposition, Green Hills of Africa was presented as a non-fiction narrative, an account of his safari. Hemingway experimented with its form, aiming to write a book that was absolutely true, a factual narrative that would read with the intensity and dramatic arc of a novel. He sought to capture the essence of the African landscape, the thrill of the hunt, and the camaraderie among the hunting party. The book chronicles the daily events of the safari, detailing the tracking of kudu, lion and other animals, the challenges of the terrain, and the interactions with the local guides and trackers. Through these descriptions, Hemingway explored his passion for big game hunting, presenting it not as a sport of mere killing, but as a test of skill, patience, and respect for the animal. He saw the hunt as a way to connect with a more primitive, authentic existence, a direct engagement with the natural world that he felt was increasingly lost in modern life. Beyond the hunting narratives, Green Hills of Africa delves into Hemingway's literary theories and reflections on writing. He interspersed the action with discussions about the craft of storytelling, the merits of various authors, and his own ambitions as a writer. This interweaving of personal adventure and literary commentary showcased his ongoing commitment to developing a distinct American prose style, lean and truthful, capable of conveying profound experience without excessive embellishment. The safari and the resulting book reinforced Hemingway's public image as an adventurous, rugged individual, deeply connected to the wild. It further solidified his literary themes of grace under pressure, the dignity of struggle, and the pursuit of an authentic, unvarnished life, all set against the majestic and unforgiving backdrop of the African continent. While Ernest Hemingway continued to explore distant lands and challenging pursuits, a new figure entered his life who would profoundly impact his personal narrative and his engagement with the world's unfolding conflicts. This was Martha Gellhorn, a woman of formidable intellect, independence, and an equally adventurous spirit. Their paths first crossed in Key West in 1936. Martha Gellhorn was already a seasoned writer and journalist, possessing a keen eye for social injustice and a fearless drive to report from the front lines of history. Born in 1908, she had, by her mid-20s, established herself as a significant voice, reporting on the Great Depression's impact in America and demonstrating a deep empathy for those suffering. Her professional identity was firmly rooted in her commitment to bearing witness and speaking truth. When Gellhorn met Hemingway, their connection was immediate and intense. They shared a mutual attraction to danger, a fascination with conflict, and a profound dedication to the craft of writing. Gellhorn was not merely an admirer of Hemingway's work, she was an accomplished professional in her own right, possessing a strength of character and a clarity of purpose that drew him in. Unlike some of his previous companions, she had her own career, her own ambitions, and a strong sense of self that was not easily overshadowed. Their relationship quickly developed, fueled by their shared intellectual curiosity and a restless desire for authentic experience. Gellhorn's independence was a defining characteristic. She was fiercely autonomous, unwilling to be relegated to a secondary role. This very quality, initially attractive to Hemingway, would later become a point of contention, as his own desire for control often clashed with her unwavering self-reliance. Their shared passion for journalism, particularly war correspondence, became a central element of their bond. As the political landscape of Europe grew increasingly volatile, Gellhorn's instincts drew her towards the unfolding crises. Hemingway, too, was compelled by the larger movements of history. He's seeing in war a crucible for human behaviour and an inevitable subject for his fiction. Their partnership would soon lead them to the battlefields of the Spanish Civil War, a conflict that would cement their professional and personal alliance while simultaneously testing its boundaries. Martha Gellhorn's presence in Hemingway's life marked a significant shift, introducing a dynamic of intellectual and professional equality that had not been as pronounced in his previous relationships. She was a companion who could not only keep pace with his adventurous spirit, but often outpace him in her own relentless pursuit of truth from the world's most dangerous corners. Their story was poised to unfold amidst the chaos of global conflict, each seeking to understand and report on the human condition under duress. In July of 1936, the fragile political landscape of Spain fractured into open civil war. A military uprising led by General Francisco Franco sought to overthrow the democratically elected Republican government. This conflict quickly escalated beyond Spain's borders, drawing in international volunteers and becoming a proxy battleground for the ideological struggles that would soon engulf Europe. For many intellectuals and artists of the era, the Spanish Civil War represented a clear division between fascism and democracy, a moral imperative that demanded engagement. Ernest Hemingway, with his deep affection for Spain and its culture, felt an immediate and profound connection to the unfolding tragedy. His earlier experiences with bullfighting had provided him with an intimate understanding of Spanish identity and a respect for its people. The thought of this vibrant nation being torn apart by internal strife, with external powers already beginning to intervene, stirred his convictions. He believed strongly in the cause of the Loyalists, the Republican forces defending the elected government against Franco's nationalists. His decision to go to Spain was not merely an impulse for adventure, though that element was undeniably present in his character. It was driven by a genuine political and moral commitment. He saw the conflict as a crucial struggle for freedom and human dignity, a fight against the encroaching darkness of authoritarianism. Hemingway felt a responsibility to bear witness, to report on the realities of the war, and to lend his considerable influence to the Republican cause. He arrived in Spain in the spring of 1937, initially as a correspondent for the North American Newspaper Alliance, NANA, accompanied by Martha Gellhorn. Their presence on the ground was not just to observe, but to actively engage with the narrative of the war. Hemingway's dispatches from Spain were marked by a raw immediacy and a stark realism, reflecting his direct exposure to the fighting and the suffering it caused. He moved through various sectors of the front, observing battles, interviewing soldiers, and experiencing the daily realities of life under siege. His presence in Madrid, particularly during its intense bombardment, became emblematic of his commitment. He was often found in dangerous locations, observing the impact of shelling firsthand, absorbing the atmosphere of fear and resilience. This immersion was not simply for journalistic purposes. It was a deeply personal engagement with the unfolding events. He sought to understand the courage and the terror, the idealism and the despair that characterized the conflict. The Spanish Civil War became a pivotal experience for Hemingway, shaping his political consciousness and providing fertile ground for some of his most enduring literary work. He did not merely report on history, he lived within its tumultuous currents, his convictions deepening with each passing day. Hemingway's time on the Spanish front lines was characterized by an intense immersion in the conflict. He didn't merely observe from a distance, but sought out the heart of the fighting, often placing himself in positions of considerable danger. His dispatches for the North American Newspaper Alliance were vivid and immediate, conveying the brutal realities of modern warfare, the sound of shells, the faces of weary soldiers, the resilience of civilians under bombardment. He reported from Madrid during its prolonged siege, enduring air raids and constant threats, documenting the city's defiance. Beyond his journalistic reports, Hemingway became deeply involved in a project that aimed to bring the plight of the Spanish Republic to a wider American audience. The documentary film The Spanish Earth. This film was conceived by Joris Evans, a Dutch documentary filmmaker, and funded by a group of American intellectuals and artists, including Lillian Hellman and Archibald MacLeish. The intention was to counter the prevalent misinformation about the war and to galvanize support for the Loyalists. Hemingway contributed significantly to The Spanish Earth, uttered not only through his presence and connections on the ground, but also by providing the film's narration. His voice, with its distinct rhythm and authority, delivered the documentary's powerful message. He travelled with the film crew to various locations, including the Ebro front, capturing images of soldiers, farmers, and the devastating impact of the war on ordinary lives. The film contrasted the quiet dignity of Spanish peasants attempting to irrigate their land with the brutal reality of aerial bombardment and fascist aggression. The creation of The Spanish Earth was an arduous undertaking fraught with the dangers of wartime filmmaking. Hemingway's involvement extended beyond narration. He was a vocal advocate for the project, understanding its potential to sway public opinion in the United States. He believed that if Americans could see the truth of what was happening, they would instinctively support the side fighting for democracy. Upon its completion, Hemingway toured America to promote The Spanish Earth, often introducing screenings himself. He addressed audiences with passionate appeals for aid to the Spanish Republic, recounting his first-hand experiences and emphasizing the moral urgency of the conflict. These fundraising efforts aimed to gather medical supplies and other humanitarian assistance for the beleaguered Loyalists. His voice, both on screen and in person, carried the weight of direct observation, lending credibility and emotional force to the Republican cause. Through this film, Hemingway sought to bridge the vast distance between the battlefields of Spain and the consciousness of the American public, and hoping to inspire a collective response to what he viewed as a crucial fight for the future. The intense experiences of the Spanish Civil War, witnessed firsthand by Hemingway, eventually coalesced into one of his most significant literary achievements, the novel For Whom the Bell Tolls. Begun in 1939, shortly after the Republican defeat, and published in 1940, the novel served as a profound exploration of the conflict's human dimensions, moving beyond journalistic reportage to delve into the moral and psychological complexities of war. The narrative centers on Robert Jordan, an American dynamiter fighting with a band of anti-fascist guerrillas in the mountains of Spain. His mission is to blow up a bridge, a seemingly small act that nonetheless holds immense strategic importance for a larger Republican offensive. The story unfolds over a mere 3 days, yet within this compressed time frame, Hemingway masterfully constructs a world rich with character, tension, and philosophical inquiry. A central theme woven throughout For Whom the Bell Tolls is sacrifice. Jordan and the guerrillas are acutely aware of the personal cost of their actions, often facing certain death for a cause they believe in. Their individual lives are subsumed by the larger struggle, a poignant reflection of the collective sacrifice demanded by total war. This theme is underscored by the novel's title, drawn from John Donne's meditation, which speaks to the interconnectedness of humanity and the idea that the death of any person diminishes everyone. Loyalty forms another foundational pillar of the narrative. Robert Jordan develops deep bonds with the Spanish partisans, Pablo, Pilar, Agustin, and Maria, in a short span of time. These relationships are forged in the crucible of shared danger and a common purpose. The novel examines the various forms loyalty can take: loyalty to a political ideal, to comrades in arms, and to the newfound love between Jordan and Maria. Yet, it also explores the betrayals and internal conflicts that can fracture such allegiances, revealing the fragility of human trust amidst chaos. The human cost of conflict permeates every page of For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway does not shy away from depicting the brutality and moral compromises inherent in war. The novel portrays acts of both extreme cruelty and profound compassion, illustrating the ways in which war can strip away civility while simultaneously revealing the deepest reserves of human courage and tenderness. The characters grapple with fear, loss, and the ever-present shadow of death, their personal tragedies mirroring the larger tragedy unfolding across Spain. Through Robert Jordan's internal monologues and his interactions with the guerrillas, Hemingway explores the existential questions prompted by war, the nature of duty, the justification of violence, and the search for meaning in a world consumed by destruction. For Whom the Bell Tolls stands as a powerful testament to the Spanish Civil War, not merely as a historical event, but as a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance, loyalty, and the capacity for both love and brutality. It cemented Hemingway's reputation as a master chronicler of the human condition under duress, leaving an indelible mark on the literary landscape. Sect. The years surrounding the Spanish Civil War and the creation of For Whom the Bell Tolls were also a period of significant upheaval in Ernest Hemingway's personal life. His marriage to Pauline Pfeiffer, which had once seemed a passionate and stable union, gradually began to unravel. The initial excitement and shared interest that had drawn them together in the 1920s had, by the late 1930s, given way to increasing strain and distance. Pauline, a sophisticated and intelligent woman, had provided a sense of order and domesticity to Hemingway's often chaotic existence, particularly in Key West, where they raised their 2 sons. However, Hemingway's restless nature, his prolonged absences for reporting and adventure, and his deepening entanglement with Martha Gellhorn during the Spanish conflict, placed an insurmountable burden on their relationship. The emotional chasm between Ernest and Pauline widened, eventually becoming irreparable. The divorce from Pauline Pfeiffer was finalized in 1940. This separation marked the end of a 14-year marriage, a period during which Hemingway had achieved considerable literary success and built a family. The dissolution was a painful one, affecting not only Hemingway and Pauline but also their children. It underscored a recurring pattern in Hemingway's life: the intensity with which he pursued new experiences and relationships often came at the expense of existing commitments, leaving a trail of emotional complexity. Soon after his divorce, in November of 1940, Ernest Hemingway married Martha Gellhorn. Their union had been anticipated, having developed over several years of shared adventures, particularly their time together reporting from the front lines of the Spanish Civil War. Martha was not merely a companion, she was an accomplished journalist and novelist in her own right, possessing an independent spirit and a formidable intellect that matched Hemingway's own. The marriage to Martha Gellhorn was characterized by a dynamic of 2 exceptionally strong and independent individuals. Both were driven by a profound desire to witness history unfold, to report on it, and to live life with an intense, almost visceral engagement. This shared ambition was initially a powerful bond, fueling their travels and their creative endeavours. They were a formidable pair, their lives intertwined with global events and literary pursuits. However, yet the very qualities that drew them together also presented significant challenges for sustaining a domestic partnership. Martha's fierce independence and her own career aspirations meant she was not content to remain in Hemingway's shadow or to play a secondary role. She was equally committed to her work and her own experiences, often leading to clashes with Hemingway's increasingly dominant personality and his expectations for a wife. The dynamic between 2 such powerful, self-possessed individuals, both accustomed to leading and defining their own paths, would prove difficult to navigate within the confines of a marriage, setting the stage for future complexities in their shared life. With the onset of World War II, Ernest Hemingway found himself drawn once more to the heart of global conflict. He is a familiar landscape for his restless spirit. His experiences in the previous war and his reporting from Spain had solidified his reputation as a correspondent uniquely suited to capturing the grim realities of battle. As the conflict escalated, Hemingway sought to contribute, not merely as a detached observer, but as an active participant in understanding and shaping the narrative of the war. Initially, his involvement took an unconventional form. From his home in Cuba, he organised a civilian anti-submarine patrol, using his fishing boat the Pilar to search for German U-boats in the Caribbean. This privateering effort, dubbed the Crook Factory, was a blend of patriotic zeal and adventurous spirit, though its practical effectiveness in actual anti-submarine warfare remained limited. Nevertheless, allowed Hemingway to feel directly engaged in the war effort, even as he was far from the main theatres of combat. His activities included gathering intelligence, however amateurish, and reporting his findings to the American embassy, blurring the lines between private citizen and unofficial operative. As the war progressed and the United States entered the conflict more formally, Hemingway's desire to be closer to the action intensified. In 1944, he travelled to Europe as a war correspondent for Collier's magazine, eager to witness the Allied invasion and liberation firsthand. This placed him in a unique position to observe some of the most pivotal moments of the war. He was present during the D-Day landings, though he did not land with the first wave, instead observing from a landing craft offshore. His subsequent movements took him through France, where he attached himself to various units, including the 22nd Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Charles Buck Lanham, a figure for whom Hemingway developed considerable admiration. Hemingway's time in Europe during the war was marked by a characteristic disregard for conventional journalistic detachment. He became deeply embedded with the troops, often participating in small-scale actions, carrying weapons and offering advice, behaviour that went beyond the typical role of a war correspondent. He claimed to have participated in the liberation of Paris, leading a small, self-assembled group of French resistance fighters, though the extent of his direct involvement in actual combat during this period remains a subject of historical debate and varied interpretation. What is clear is his proximity to the fighting, his intense engagement with the soldiers, and his deep immersion in the atmosphere of wartime Europe. These experiences provided him with rich material, though the direct literary output from this period would manifest later. As World War II cast its shadow across the globe, the waters surrounding Cuba became a strategic area, traversed by Allied shipping lanes, and consequently a hunting ground for German U-boats. From his Finca Vigia estate overlooking the Caribbean, Ernest Hemingway observed these developments with a growing sense of personal responsibility and a desire to contribute to the Allied cause. His solution was both imaginative and distinctly his own: to convert his beloved fishing boat the Pilar into an impromptu patrol vessel. The Pilar, a 38-foot wheeler playmate, was already famous in Hemingway's personal mythology, a vessel upon which he had pursued marlin and engaged in deep-sea adventures. Now it was to be repurposed for a different kind of hunt. In 1942, with the tacit approval of the US Navy and the American ambassador to Cuba, Hemingway launched what he called his Crook Factory operation. The intent was to patrol the waters off the Cuban coast, searching for German submarines that might be lurking in the shipping lanes or seeking refuge in the shallow quays. Hemingway enlisted a crew of loyal friends and local Cubans, including his longtime fishing companion, Carlos Gutierrez. The Pilar was equipped not with sophisticated sonar or depth charges, but with a collection of rifles, machine guns, and even hand grenades. The plan, as Hemingway envisioned it, was audacious. If a U-boat surfaced, the Pilar crew would open fire attempting to disable the vessel or at the very least disrupt its operations until more substantial naval forces could arrive. If a submarine remained submerged, the strategy involved dropping grenades to damage its periscope or force it to surface. The reality of these patrols was, predictably, less dramatic than the vision. The Pilar was a small wooden boat, ill-suited for anti-submarine warfare against heavily armoured and technologically advanced German U-boats. The likelihood of a direct engagement proving effective was exceedingly low. However, the patrols served another purpose. They allowed Hemingway to gather information, however anecdotal, about suspicious activities in Cuban waters. He would relay these observations to the American embassy in Havana, acting as a sort of informal intelligence gatherer. These excursions were characterized by long hours at sea, often under the tropical sun, punctuated by the familiar rhythms of fishing life, occasionally interspersed with genuine vigilance for enemy vessels. While no German U-boat was ever directly engaged or sunk by the Pilar or its crew, Hemingway's efforts demonstrated his unwavering commitment to the war. It was an unconventional, even quixotic contribution, but one that allowed him to express his patriotism and his inherent adventurous spirit during a time of global conflict. The Pilar, once a vessel of leisure and sport, briefly became a symbol of a writer's unique and personal engagement with the immense machinery of war, where, following his unconventional naval patrols in the Caribbean, Ernest Hemingway found himself drawn directly into the European theatre of World War II. He arrived in Europe as a war correspondent, attached to the US Third Army, ultimately witnessing the Allied advance across France. Among the many pivotal moments of this period, his presence during the liberation of Paris in August 1944 stands out as particularly emblematic of his desire for direct involvement and his tendency to blur the lines between observer and participant. As Allied forces approached the French capital, an uprising by the French resistance was already underway within the city. Hemingway, accompanied by a small group of irregulars and French resistance fighters, made his way towards Paris. Accounts from this period suggest a somewhat chaotic and certainly unconventional approach to reporting. While other correspondents maintained a more detached position, Hemingway embraced a more active, almost combatant role. He was seen driving a jeep, often armed, moving through the outskirts of the city. Stories circulated, and were sometimes encouraged by Hemingway himself, of his direct participation in skirmishes, even claiming to have liberated the Ritz Hotel. This particular anecdote became a part of the Hemingway legend. Arriving at the Ritz, a place he knew well from his earlier expatriate years, and personally ordering drinks for himself and his companions, claiming the hotel for the Allies. While the spirit of this tale resonated with his adventurous persona, the actual military significance of his individual actions was minimal. His involvement, however, was not without controversy. As a war correspondent, Hemingway was technically a non-combatant, bound by the Geneva Conventions. His carrying of weapons and active participation in what could be construed as military actions raised questions about his adherence to these regulations. There were accusations from military authorities that he had violated his status as a journalist. Yet, for Hemingway, the boundaries between observation and action were often fluid, especially when confronted with events of such magnitude. His presence in Paris during its liberation allowed him to experience firsthand the euphoria and the lingering tension of a city emerging from years of occupation. It provided him with vivid material for his later writings and reinforced his image as a man who sought out the most intense experiences life had to offer. Though his precise military contributions remain debated by historians, his undeniable presence amidst the unfolding drama of Paris's liberation cemented another facet of the legend surrounding Ernest Hemingway. Amidst the tumult and profound experiences of World War II, Ernest Hemingway's personal landscape continued to shift. It was during this period in London in 1944 that he encountered Mary Welsh, a fellow American journalist. Their meeting occurred at a time when Hemingway's marriage to Martha Gellhorn was under considerable strain, already showing signs of the eventual dissolution that would follow the war's end. Mary Welsh was a correspondent for Time and Life magazines, a woman of intelligence, wit, and independence, much like Martha. She possessed a strong will and a practical nature, qualities that appealed to Hemingway. Their initial connection was immediate and intense, a characteristic pattern in Hemingway's romantic life. He was captivated by her spirit and her capacity to navigate the demanding world of wartime reporting. Their relationship developed rapidly against the backdrop of a continent at war. As Hemingway moved through the European theatre, Welsh was also present, experiencing the conflict from her own journalistic perspective. This shared understanding of the extraordinary circumstances they found themselves in deepened their bond. The challenges and dangers of wartime reporting fostered a unique intimacy between them. Upon the conclusion of the war, and following his divorce from Martha Gellhorn, Hemingway married Mary Welsh in March 1946. She became his fourth wife, embarking on a union that would endure for the remainder of his life. In many ways, Mary brought a different dynamic to Hemingway's often tempestuous personal world. She was capable of managing his complex personality and the demands of his lifestyle, which included his need for solitude for writing, his love of travel, and his frequent social engagements. While not without its own difficulties and strains, their marriage provided Hemingway with a degree of domestic stability that had often been elusive in his previous relationships. Mary dedicated herself to supporting his work, creating an environment where he could write, and managing their various homes, particularly the finca in Cuba. She often took on the role of protector, shielding him from distractions and managing the practicalities of his increasingly public life. Her presence allowed him to focus more intently on his literary endeavours, even as his health and mental state would gradually decline in the years to come. Mary Welsh remained a constant, steadfast companion, navigating the complex final chapters of Ernest Hemingway's life. High above the small Cuban village of San Francisco de Paula, nestled amidst palm trees and lush vegetation, stood Finca Vigia, Lookout Farm. This estate, purchased by Hemingway in 1940, became his most enduring and beloved home, a sanctuary where he lived for over 2 decades, longer than anywhere else. It was here that much of his later work was conceived and written, and where his distinctive lifestyle truly flourished. The finca was a spacious, airy house, built in 1886, with thick walls and high ceilings designed to offer respite from the tropical heat. From its elevated position, Hemingway could gaze out over the distant Havana skyline and the shimmering Caribbean Sea, a view that undoubtedly fed his expansive imagination. The property itself was sprawling, encompassing 9 acres of land, providing ample space for his various passions. Inside, the finca was a reflection of the man himself. Bookshelves overflowed with thousands of volumes spanning literature, history, and natural science, testament to his voracious reading habits. Animal trophies from his African safaris adorn the walls, silent reminders of his adventures and his engagement with the wild. The house was also filled with art, collected during his travels, and the comfortable, lived-in furniture that spoke of a life fully experienced. Beyond the main house, the finca offered further expressions of Hemingway's character. A swimming pool, often frequented by his beloved cats, provided a cool escape. A separate 3-story tower, initially intended for his writing, eventually became a storage space for his extensive collection of fishing gear and other personal effects, as he preferred to write standing up in his bedroom. His fishing boat, the Pilar, was often docked at nearby Kojima, but its spirit was very much a part of the Finca's atmosphere, representing his deep connection to the sea. Finca Vigia was more than just a residence. It was a living museum of Hemingway's life and work. It was a place of intense creative output, where he would rise early to write in the quiet hours of the morning, his focus unwavering. It was also a vibrant social hub, where friends, fellow writers, and notable figures from around the world were entertained with generous hospitality. The Finca represented a profound sense of belonging for Hemingway, a place where he could be both the solitary artist and the gregarious papa, surrounded by the things and the environment that most inspired him. Its tranquil beauty offered a profound counterpoint to the dramatic narratives he continued to craft. In 1950, a decade after settling at Finca Vigia, Ernest Hemingway published Across the River and Into the Trees. This novel, set in post-World War II Venice, tells the story of Colonel Richard Cantwell, a 50-year-old American officer reflecting on his life, his military experiences, and his love for a young Italian countess. The work drew heavily from Hemingway's own wartime experiences and his personal relationships, particularly his affection for a young Italian woman he had met in Venice. Upon its release, the novel received a notably cool and often hostile reception from critics. Many reviewers expressed disappointment, finding the work to be a pale imitation of Hemingway's earlier, more celebrated achievements. The dialogue, once praised for its crispness and authenticity, was now often described as strained or self-parodying. Some critics found Cantwell, the protagonist, to be an overly self-pitying figure, rather than the stoic hero typically associated with Hemingway's writing. There was a sense that the author was repeating himself, or perhaps more critically, that his distinctive style had ossified into a mannerism. The novel was perceived by some as indulgent, too overtly autobiographical, and lacking the universal resonance that characterized works like A Farewell to Arms, or For Whom the Bell Tolls. The raw emotional honesty that had once captivated readers now seemed, to some, to verge on sentimentality. The narrative structure, too, was criticized for its perceived looseness and lack of dramatic tension. This critical response marked a significant shift in Hemingway's literary standing. For years he'd been regarded as one of America's most important and innovative writers. His work consistently met with widespread acclaim. Across the River and Into the Trees signalled a period of declining critical fortune, suggesting that his influence might be waning, or that his artistic vision was no longer as sharp as it once had been. The novel became a point of contention, contributing to a narrative that Hemingway's best work might be behind him. This reception, undoubtedly, was a difficult experience for an author accustomed to adulation, and it placed considerable pressure on his subsequent creative endeavours. Following the less than enthusiastic reception of Across the River and Into the Trees, Ernest Hemingway entered a period of intense creative focus. He sought to write a story that would reaffirm his literary prowess, a work that possessed the clarity and emotional depth for which he had become known. The result was The Old Man and the Sea, a novella published in 1952. This concise narrative emerged from his deep familiarity with Cuban fishing culture, a world he'd observed intimately from Finca Vigia. The story centers on Santiago, an aging Cuban fisherman who has gone 84 days without catching a fish. On the 85th day, he ventures far out into the Gulf Stream, where he hooks an enormous marlin larger than any he has ever seen. The novella then meticulously chronicles Santiago's epic multi-day struggle to land the fish, a battle of endurance and will between man and nature. His only companion during this ordeal is his profound respect for the magnificent creature he is attempting to subdue. The Old Man and the Sea explores profound themes with a deceptive simplicity. It delves into the nature of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, the quiet dignity of struggle, and the often painful reality of victory that can also bring loss. Santiago's battle is not merely against the marlin, but against the forces of nature, against his own aging body, and against the perceived failures of his past. The relationship between Santiago and the marlin is depicted with a deep sense of admiration and interconnectedness, transcending a simple hunter-prey dynamic. Upon its publication, The Old Man and the Sea was an immediate and resounding critical success. It appeared first in its entirety in Life magazine in September 1952, selling over 5 million copies in just 2 days. Critics lauded its return to the classic Hemingway style, lean prose, powerful imagery, and universal themes. Reviewers praised its poignant portrayal of human resilience, its masterful characterization of Santiago, and its evocative depiction of the sea. The novella was seen as a triumphant return to form for Hemingway, silencing many of the doubts raised by his previous work. It re-established him as a preeminent voice in American literature, and its widespread acclaim laid the groundwork for further recognition. The overwhelming success of The Old Man and the Sea did more than simply restore Ernest Hemingway's literary standing. It paved the way for the highest honour a writer can receive. In 1954, the Swedish Academy announced that Ernest Hemingway was the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Literature. This prestigious award recognised his entire body of work, acknowledging his mastery of narrative art and his profound influence on contemporary style. The official citation from the Swedish Academy spoke of his mastery of the art of narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea, and for the influence that he has exerted on contemporary style. So, while The Old Man and the Sea was explicitly mentioned as the most recent testament to his genius, the award was a culmination of decades of groundbreaking literary contributions. It acknowledged the spare yet potent prose he had pioneered, the memorable characters he had brought to life, and the enduring themes he had explored across his novels and short stories. Hemingway, however, was unable to attend the ceremony in Stockholm due to injuries sustained in 2 separate plane crashes in Africa earlier that year. His ambassador to Sweden, John C. Cabot, read his acceptance speech on his behalf. In this speech, Hemingway humbly reflected on the solitary nature of a writer's work and the inherent imperfections of art. He stated, "A writer, when he is good, should be like an iceberg. 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows." This metaphor perfectly encapsulated his own stylistic philosophy, emphasizing the hidden depths and unstated implications within his seemingly simple narratives. The Nobel Prize cemented Ernest Hemingway's place as a literary giant on a global scale. It brought his work to an even wider international audience and confirmed his status as one of the most significant authors of the 20th century. This recognition transcended mere commercial success. It was an affirmation from the highest echelons of the literary world that his contributions had reshaped the landscape of modern fiction. The award served as a powerful validation of his unique voice and the enduring impact of his storytelling, ensuring his legacy would extend far into the future, and studied and admired across cultures and generations. It marked the pinnacle of his public acclaim, an undeniable testament to his profound and lasting influence. In late 1953, with the success of The Old Man and the Sea still resonating, Ernest Hemingway embarked on another African safari with his wife, Mary. This journey, intended for hunting and enjoyment, quickly turned into a harrowing ordeal of survival, leaving him with injuries that would plague him for the remainder of his life. The first incident occurred on January 21, 1954, over Uganda. Hemingway and Mary were flying in a small Cessna aircraft to photograph Murchison Falls from the air. During the flight, the plane struck an abandoned utility pole, causing it to crash. Both Hemingway and Mary sustained injuries. Mary suffered 2 broken ribs, while Hemingway experienced a ruptured liver a fractured skull and severe burns. Despite the gravity of their situation, they were fortunate to survive the initial impact. Word of their crash spread, and a rescue plane was dispatched to retrieve them. However, fate intervened with a cruel twist. As they were being transported for medical attention, the rescue plane itself caught fire during takeoff and crashed. This second, even more severe accident occurred the very next day. While Mary again escaped with less critical injuries, Hemingway suffered further, more extensive damage. His head injuries worsened, leading to cranial hemorrhages, and he endured a crushed vertebra, a ruptured kidney, and burns over a significant portion of his body. His vision and hearing were also severely compromised. The cumulative effect of these two crashes was devastating. Hemingway was in immense pain, and his recovery was slow and arduous. The physical trauma was profound, but the psychological impact was equally significant. These accidents, coming so close together, deeply affected his mental state. He experienced periods of intense pain, memory loss, and increasing paranoia. The sustained physical suffering exacerbated his existing health issues and likely contributed to a deepening sense of despair. The news of these crashes, initially reported as fatal by some news outlets, created a dramatic stir globally. While he eventually recovered enough to return home, the incidents left an indelible mark. The injuries from these African plane crashes became a constant companion, a source of chronic pain and discomfort that steadily eroded his physical and mental resilience in the years that followed, profoundly altering the trajectory of his later life. The cumulative effect of the African plane crashes, coupled with a lifetime of physically demanding pursuits and heavy alcohol consumption, began to manifest as a profound and irreversible decline in Ernest Hemingway's health during his final years. The injuries sustained in Africa, the fractured skull, ruptured liver and kidney, crushed vertebra, and extensive burns, never fully healed. They became a persistent source of chronic pain, requiring frequent medical attention and making even simple movements difficult. His once formidable physique, a symbol of his adventurous spirit, began to betray him. Mobility became increasingly limited, and the vibrant energy that had defined his earlier decades slowly dissipated. This physical deterioration was inextricably linked to a deepening psychological distress. The brain injuries in particular are now understood to have contributed significantly to his cognitive decline and mood disturbances. Hemingway's relationship with alcohol, long a part of his public persona and social life, intensified in these years, transitioning from heavy drinking to a severe dependence. This escalation exacerbated his physical ailments, particularly his liver problems, and further clouded his mental clarity. Alcohol, which he may have used to self-medicate for pain and anxiety, instead became a destructive force, eroding his judgment and exacerbating his depressive tendencies. The onset of severe depression became increasingly evident. His characteristic bravado and resilience began to wane, replaced by periods of profound sadness, paranoia, and a growing sense of hopelessness. He became increasingly isolated, withdrawing from friends and sometimes even from Mary. His ability to write, once his most reliable source of purpose and expression, was severely hampered by his failing health. Concentration became difficult, and the meticulous craftsmanship that defined his best work proved increasingly elusive. The Nobel Prize, awarded in 1954, though a monumental achievement, seemed to offer little solace amidst his suffering. Instead, the pressure and public scrutiny may have added to his burdens, highlighting the contrast between his celebrated public image and his private torment. He struggled with memory loss, bouts of confusion, and increasingly erratic behavior. The man who had once embodied strength and control now found himself increasingly vulnerable, caught in a relentless downward spiral of physical decay and mental anguish. This period marked a tragic erosion of the qualities that had defined him, leaving him increasingly diminished and profoundly suffering. As Ernest Hemingway's physical and mental health deteriorated, the public gaze upon him intensified, creating a complex and often painful dynamic. His fame, which had grown steadily since the 1920s, had by this point reached mythic proportions. The image of Papa Hemingway, the rugged adventurer, the big game hunter, the deep-sea fisherman, and the war correspondent, had become deeply ingrained in the popular imagination. This persona, which he'd meticulously crafted and often embraced, now began to overshadow the very literary work that had created it. The media, always eager for a compelling story, frequently focused on his exploits and eccentricities, rather than the nuanced artistry of his prose. Every public appearance, every pronouncement, every photograph was scrutinized. This constant attention, while a testament to his cultural impact, also became an increasing burden, particularly as his health declined. The expectation to embody the robust, invincible figure he had projected became an almost impossible task for a man struggling with chronic pain, cognitive difficulties, and profound depression. His personal struggles, once somewhat private or known only within his immediate circle, now became subjects of public discussion and speculation. The very qualities that had endeared him to readers, his intensity, his passion, his forthrightness, could also be misconstrued or exaggerated by the press, leading to portrayals that often felt reductive or even cruel. He was simultaneously revered and dissected, a public spectacle enduring both admiration and judgment. The pressure of maintaining this larger-than-life image while battling internal demons was immense. There was a sense that the man himself had become more famous than his books, that the legend had eclipsed the literature. This was a source of frustration for Hemingway, who ultimately wished to be judged by his writing. Yet the public appetite for the Hemingway story often seemed insatiable, demanding more of the persona than of the prose. This constant public scrutiny, combined with his declining health, contributed to his increasing paranoia and sense of persecution. He felt observed, judged, and misunderstood, trapped within a public narrative that no longer fully encompassed or accurately reflected his reality. The weight of his own celebrity, once a source of validation, now felt like a heavy chain, binding him to an image he could no longer sustain. Amidst the mounting personal and health crises that defined Ernest Hemingway's later life, an unseen pressure was also at play, the watchful eye of the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation. During the height of the Cold War, a period marked by intense paranoia and suspicion regarding communist influence, Hemingway's activities and associations drew the attention of federal agents. His long-standing residence in Cuba, a nation growing increasingly isolated from the United States, naturally placed him under a certain degree of scrutiny. Yet Hemingway's past political leanings and public statements also contributed to this surveillance. His fervent support for the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War, his friendships with individuals on the political left, and his general anti-fascist stance, while admirable to many, were viewed with suspicion by some elements within the US government during the McCarthy era and beyond. In an atmosphere where ideological purity was demanded, even a celebrated writer could become a person of interest. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, maintained a file on Hemingway, meticulously documenting his movements, his visitors, and even his conversations, often through informants. This surveillance was not merely a passive collection of data. It represented an active effort to assess whether Hemingway posed a security risk or if his influence could be seen as detrimental to American interests. The fact that a figure of his stature, a Nobel laureate, was deemed worthy of such attention speaks to the pervasive climate of fear and suspicion that characterized the Cold War. For Hemingway himself, this covert observation likely contributed to his growing sense of paranoia during his final years. While he may not have been fully aware of the extent of the FBI's activities, the general atmosphere of suspicion, combined with his own declining mental state, could easily have fueled his anxieties. The feeling of being watched, of having his actions and words potentially misinterpreted by unseen forces, would have been deeply unsettling for a man who valued his independence and freedom of expression above all else. The existence of these surveillance files provides a sobering backdrop to his final struggles. It illustrates how even a global literary icon could not escape the political pressures of his time. The Cold War's shadow extended even to the quiet solitude of Finca Vigia, transforming the beloved Cuban estate into a place under observation. This layer of external pressure, though perhaps not always consciously felt, undoubtedly added to the complex array of challenges Hemingway faced as his life drew to a close, further eroding his sense of peace and security. The political landscape of Cuba, which had long provided a stable and inspiring sanctuary for Ernest Hemingway, it began to shift dramatically with the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Fidel Castro's ascent to power heralded a new era, one that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Cuba and the United States. For Hemingway, who had lived at Finca Vigia for over 2 decades, this unfolding political drama presented an increasingly untenable situation. Initially, Hemingway had expressed some sympathy for the revolutionary cause, having always possessed an anti-establishment streak and a preference for the underdog. He even met Fidel Castro personally, sharing a fishing encounter that seemed to suggest a potential for coexistence. However, as the revolutionary government solidified its power and its policies became more explicitly anti-American, the environment for an expatriate like Hemingway grew increasingly complex and fraught with uncertainty. The normalization of relations between the two countries deteriorated rapidly, leading to economic embargoes and a climate of mutual distrust. The decision to leave Cuba was not an easy one for Hemingway. Finca Vigia was more than just a house. It was the nexus of his later life, a place where he had written some of his most enduring works, hosted countless friends, and found a degree of peace and routine. The lush gardens, the swimming pool, the dogs and cats, the meticulously arranged library, all were deeply intertwined with his identity and his creative process. To abandon this beloved home was to sever a profound connection to a place that had become an extension of himself. In the summer of 1960, as relations between the US and Cuba spiraled downward, Hemingway and his wife Mary made the difficult choice to depart. It was not intended as a permanent farewell, but rather a temporary retreat to their home in Ketchum, Idaho, with the hope of returning when circumstances improved. Yet the political currents proved too strong. The increasing nationalization of property and the growing hostility between the two nations made a return to Finca Vigia impossible. The departure from Cuba was thus a forced farewell, laden with a deep sense of loss. It marked the end of an era for Hemingway, severing him from a place that had nourished his spirit and his art for so long. The emotional toll of leaving his cherished home, combined with his escalating health problems and profound depression, contributed to the overwhelming sense of displacement and despair that characterized his final months. He left behind a significant portion of his life, his books, his memories, and a piece of his very soul, never to set foot in his Cuban sanctuary again. Following the reluctant departure from his Cuban sanctuary, Ernest Hemingway sought refuge in Ketchum, Idaho. This rugged, mountainous landscape had long held an appeal for him, offering a stark contrast to the tropical warmth of Finca Vigia. He had visited the region for hunting and fishing excursions over the years, drawn by its wild beauty and the promise of solitude. In 1959, he and Mary acquired a house there, a modest dwelling overlooking the Bigwood River, intended as a seasonal retreat. It was to become his final involuntary residence. The move to Ketchum in 1960, however, was not simply a return to a familiar vacation spot. It represented a desperate attempt to find a semblance of peace and quiet, a respite from the relentless pressures that had begun to close in on him. The public fascination with his persona, the constant media intrusion, the mounting health crises, and the emotional weight of leaving Cuba had all converged to create an environment of profound unease. Idaho, with its vast, untamed expanses, seemed to offer a chance to recede from the world, to heal, and perhaps to reclaim some measure of his former self. Yet the tranquility of the Idaho mountains could not fully penetrate the deepening shadows within him. The majestic scenery, the crisp air, and the rhythms of nature that once invigorated him now seemed to offer only fleeting moments of relief. The house, while comfortable, lacked the deep resonance of Finca Vigia, a place imbued with decades of life and literary creation. It became clear that the external environment, no matter how serene, could not quell the internal turmoil that had taken root. His days in Ketchum were marked by a continuing decline. The physical ailments persisted, accompanied by an escalating battle with depression and anxiety. His once prodigious literary output had dwindled to almost nothing, a source of immense frustration for a man whose identity was so inextricably linked to his writing. The very act of concentration became a struggle. The hope that this final retreat would provide a restorative balm proved increasingly elusive. Ketchum therefore served as a poignant backdrop to his final struggles. It was a place chosen for its perceived sanctuary, a haven where he might escape the clamour and find a quiet space for reflection and recovery. Instead, it became the setting for the culmination of his long, arduous battle against the forces that were slowly, inexorably claiming him. The mountains watched silently as the great writer confronted the final chapters of his own story, far from the public gaze, in a place meant for solace, but where true peace remained just out of reach. As Ernest Hemingway settled into the Idaho landscape, the internal struggles that had long simmered beneath his formidable exterior began to erupt with increasing ferocity. The profound depression that had shadowed him through various periods of his life now took hold with an unrelenting grip, transforming his days into a landscape of despair. Simple tasks became monumental efforts, as the vibrant zest for life that had defined his youth and middle age slowly receded, replaced by a pervasive sense of emptiness and fatigue. Concurrent with this deepening depression was an escalation of paranoia. The FBI surveillance he had experienced in Cuba, while rooted in fact, now spiraled into a more generalized and debilitating suspicion. He believed he was constantly being watched, that agents were following him, listening to his conversations, and monitoring his every move. This conviction became an inescapable torment, making it difficult for him to relax or feel secure, even within the confines of his own home. He would often speak of these perceived pursuers, describing their vehicles and their methods, convinced of their presence. The once mighty engine of his literary creativity sputtered and faltered under the weight of these afflictions. Writing, which had always been his anchor, his purpose, and his greatest solace, became an almost impossible endeavour. The discipline and concentration required to craft his spare, precise prose were beyond his reach. Sentences would not form, ideas would not coalesce, and the sustained effort necessary to complete a manuscript was simply unavailable to him. This inability to write, to engage in the very act that defined him, only served to deepen his despair, creating a vicious cycle of creative paralysis and emotional suffering. His physical health also continued its precipitous decline, contributing to his mental anguish. The accumulated effects of numerous injuries, concussions, and years of heavy drinking took an undeniable toll. The chronic pain, the failing eyesight, and the general bodily weakness compounded his sense of vulnerability and hopelessness. He was a man once renowned for his physical prowess and resilience, now trapped within a body that betrayed him and a mind that tormented him. The once robust social interactions that characterized much of his life also diminished. While Mary Welsh remained a steadfast presence, his ability to engage with others became strained. The paranoia made him wary, the depression made him withdrawn, and the sheer effort of maintaining a facade of normalcy grew overwhelming. His final years were thus marked by a profound isolation, a retreat into the labyrinth of his own suffering, where the once clear lines of reality became increasingly blurred by the relentless assault of his mental and physical decline. Faced with the profound and unyielding nature of Ernest Hemingway's despair, his wife, Mary, and his doctors sought increasingly drastic measures to alleviate his suffering. Among the treatments available at the time, electroshock therapy, then known as electroconvulsive therapy or ECT, was considered a viable, albeit controversial option for severe depression. In late 1960, Hemingway was admitted to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where he began a course of these treatments. The procedure involved inducing a brief seizure in the patient by passing a controlled electric current through the brain. The precise mechanisms by which ECT worked were not fully understood, and indeed remain an area of ongoing research. However, it was believed to bring about neurochemical changes that could sometimes relieve the most severe symptoms of depression. For a man of Hemingway's temperament, renowned for his intellect and his physical courage, undergoing such a treatment must have been a deeply unsettling experience, a stark admission of his internal collapse. He received multiple sessions of electroshock therapy during his time at the Mayo Clinic. While some patients did experience temporary relief from their depressive symptoms, for Hemingway, the effectiveness was tragically limited. The profound despair, the pervasive paranoia, and the deep-seated anxieties that plagued him seemed to resist the therapeutic interventions. Instead of finding lasting solace, he often reported a distressing side effect, memory loss. This loss of memory, even if temporary or partial, was particularly cruel for a writer whose very craft depended upon the precise recall of experiences, observations, and words. He articulated his distress, feeling that the treatments were eroding the very fabric of his identity, stripping away the ability to access the wellspring of his creative life. He is reported to have expressed concerns about losing his capital, referring to the accumulated knowledge and memories that formed the foundation of his literary genius. Despite the intensity of the treatments, the improvement in his condition was negligible. He remained deeply depressed, his paranoia persisted, and his ability to function independently, let alone write, did not significantly return. The electroshock therapy, a desperate measure undertaken with the hope of restoring him, ultimately proved to be an insufficient defense against the escalating darkness within him. He left the Mayo Clinic in January 1961, no closer to true recovery. Returning to Ketchum, Idaho in the spring of 1961, Ernest Hemingway found no respite from the internal shadows that had pursued him. The electroshock treatments had not brought the promised clarity or relief. His mind, once a vibrant engine of creativity and keen observation, now felt like a cage. The paranoia, which had become a constant companion, intensified. He believed he was being watched, that federal agents were monitoring his movements and his finances, a delusion that, while rooted in some past surveillance by the FBI, had now spiraled far beyond reality. His physical health, this already compromised by years of hard living, numerous accidents, and the effects of alcoholism, continued to deteriorate. He suffered from high blood pressure, liver disease, and diabetes, each contributing to a general sense of malaise and weakness. The robust, adventurous figure known to the world was now a fragile man, struggling even with the simplest tasks. His once formidable appetite for life had diminished to a whisper. The act of writing, which had defined his existence and provided both purpose and solace, became an insurmountable challenge. The words which had once flowed with such power and precision now eluded him. He would sit at his typewriter, staring at the blank page, unable to conjure the sentences that had once come so naturally. This creative paralysis, perhaps more than any other affliction, must have been a profound torment for a man who had identified so deeply with his craft. To be a writer who could no longer write, to be a storyteller whose own story had become a burden, was an agony that few could truly comprehend. His days were marked by a profound melancholy. The once vibrant landscapes of Idaho, which he had sought for their beauty and solitude, now seemed to mirror his internal desolation. He spent long hours in a state of quiet despair, haunted by unseen forces and the relentless erosion of his own faculties. Mary, his wife, remained steadfastly by his side, a constant presence in the face of his growing isolation. She attempted to provide comfort and support, but the darkness that enveloped him was a force beyond her reach. The sense of being trapped, or of having no escape from the relentless torment of his own mind, became increasingly palpable. The world, which he had once embraced with such vigour, now felt like a hostile and incomprehensible place. His spirit, once so resilient, was finally breaking under the cumulative weight of illness, addiction, and an overwhelming, incurable sadness. The final days were a quiet, desperate struggle against an enemy he could not defeat. The morning of July 2nd, 1961, dawned quietly in Ketchum, Idaho. Ernest Hemingway, after a night of restless sleep, rose earlier than his wife, Mary. He descended to the basement of their home, a place that held his collection of firearms. The profound despair that had consumed him for so long, intensified by his physical ailments and the agonizing cessation of his creative output, had reached its ultimate point. He retrieved a double-barreled shotgun, a favoured hunting weapon. In the entryway of their house, a place between the living world and the quiet solitude of his study, he ended his own life. The sound, muffled by the early morning stillness, was heard by Mary, who quickly discovered the tragic scene. The abruptness of the act brought an immediate and devastating end to a life that had been lived with immense intensity and profound complexity. The initial public announcement from Mary Welsh Hemingway stated that her husband had died accidentally while cleaning his gun. This explanation, offered in the immediate shock and grief, sought to protect the private agony that had driven him to this final act. However, the truth, as it often does, eventually emerged. A few days later, Mary confirmed that Ernest Hemingway had indeed taken his own life. This revelation cast a sombre light on the final chapter of his remarkable, yet ultimately tormented existence. The news of his death reverberated across the globe. For many, it was an unexpected and deeply saddening conclusion to the life of a literary giant. He had been a figure of immense cultural significance, a Nobel laureate, and a symbol of a particular kind of American masculinity and adventure. His passing prompted a wave of tributes and obituaries, each attempting to grapple with the legacy of a writer whose influence had been so vast and whose personal struggles had been so deeply hidden from the public eye until the very end. The circumstances of his death also brought into sharper focus the pervasive mental health challenges he had faced. As it highlighted the devastating impact of depression, paranoia, and chronic illness, even on individuals of immense talent and public acclaim. His suicide became a poignant reminder of the internal battles that can rage unseen, regardless of external success or public image. The literary world mourned the loss of a voice that had shaped a generation, while the broader public reflected on the tragic end of a man who had, in his own way, always sought to face life and ultimately death on his own terms. His body was laid to rest in the Ketchum Cemetery, beneath the Idaho sky he'd come to admire, bringing a quiet, permanent stillness to his lifelong journey. The initial reports of Ernest Hemingway's death, attributing it to an accident while cleaning a gun, elicited a profound sense of shock across the world. For many, the idea of the robust, adventurous Papa Hemingway, a man who had faced lions and wars, succumbing to such a mundane mishap seemed incongruous with his carefully cultivated public image. There was an immediate outpouring of sorrow from readers, fellow writers and admirers who had followed his career for decades. Telegrams and condolences arrived in Ketchum from every corner of the globe, a testament to his pervasive influence. However, beneath the surface of official statements, a quiet undercurrent of disbelief and speculation began to form. Those who knew Hemingway well, or who had observed his increasingly erratic behaviour and declining health in recent years, found the accident explanation difficult to fully accept. Whispers began to circulate, fueled by an awareness of his long struggles with depression and alcoholism, which had become more pronounced in his final months. The image of the invincible literary titan had, for a discerning few, already begun to crack. The literary establishment, while expressing public grief, also engaged in private discussions about the true nature of his passing. Editors, publishers, and critics who had worked with him or reviewed his later works were aware of the profound creative block he had endured, the physical ailments that plagued him, and the deep despondency that had settled upon him. The contrast between the vibrant, forceful prose of his earlier career and the struggles of his later years was stark, prompting many to consider the possibility of a more deliberate end. When Mary Welsh Hemingway, just a few days after the initial announcement, confirmed that her husband had indeed taken his own life, the quiet speculation solidified into a sombre truth. The revelation brought a different kind of shock, one tinged with understanding and profound sadness. It reframed the narrative of his final years, offering a tragic explanation for his withdrawal, his struggles, and his ultimate despair. This confirmation did not diminish the sorrow, but rather deepened it, adding a layer of tragic inevitability to his story. It forced a re-evaluation of his life, his art, and the very nature of genius intertwined with profound human frailty. The public grappled with the image of a man who, despite achieving immense literary success and embodying a spirit of adventure, could still be overcome by internal demons. The immediate aftermath was thus a complex tapestry of grief, revelation, and a collective attempt to comprehend the final, a poignant act of a literary legend. Ernest Hemingway's death, particularly the revelation of its true nature, acted as a powerful accelerant to the myth that had been steadily building around him for decades. The dramatic end of a life lived so publicly, so intensely, and so seemingly in pursuit of raw experience, cemented his image as an archetype. He became for many the quintessential American writer, rugged, adventurous, laconic, and deeply masculine, forever grappling with themes of courage, loss, and authenticity. Posthumous narratives swiftly began to take shape, often emphasizing the more sensational aspect of his biography. The stories of bullfighting, big game hunting, deep-sea fishing, and wartime heroics were amplified, sometimes at the expense of the quieter, more introspective dimensions of his personality. The image of Papa Hemingway, the larger-than-life figure, became even more entrenched in the public consciousness, a powerful symbol of a particular kind of literary and personal strength. Yet, this burgeoning myth presented a significant challenge for those attempting to understand the complex individual beneath the legend. The man who wrote with such precision and economy, who wrestled with profound philosophical questions in his fiction, was often overshadowed by the adventurer depicted in magazine articles and newsreels. His vulnerabilities, his periods of intense self-doubt, his struggles with mental illness, and the deep emotional wounds he carried were frequently downplayed or romanticized as part of his tortured genius. The posthumous publication of his unfinished works and memoirs, such as A Movable Feast, offered glimpses into his personal life and creative process, but even these texts were often consumed through the lens of the established myth. Readers sought confirmation of the legend, sometimes overlooking the subtle complexities and the raw honesty that these writings also contained. Separating the legend from the complex individual became a perpetual endeavour for biographers and literary critics. The very qualities that made him such a compelling public figure, his charisma, his self-fashioning, his dramatic life choices, also made it difficult to penetrate the layers of his persona. The myth, once created, possessed a formidable inertia, shaping how his life and work were perceived for generations. It became a testament to the power of a compelling narrative, even one that simplified a life of immense nuance and internal conflict. The man, in many ways, became a vessel for the stories told about him, both during his lifetime and long after his final breath. In the wake of Ernest Hemingway's death, a significant new chapter unfolded in his literary legacy through the publication of several posthumous works. Among these, A Movable Feast stands as perhaps the most renowned and impactful. This memoir, assembled from manuscripts he had been working on in his final years, offered a poignant and often bittersweet recollection of his formative period in Paris during the 1920s. Published in 1964, A Movable Feast provided readers with an intimate, if somewhat romanticized, look at his early struggles as a writer, his relationships with his first wife, Hadley Richardson, and his interactions with the vibrant community of expatriate artists and writers, including Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound. The book painted a vivid picture of a young ambitious artist honing his craft amidst the cafes and streets of a bustling post-war Paris, a city he remembered with profound affection and nostalgia. The impact of A Movable Feast on Hemingway's legacy was considerable. It humanized the iconic figure, revealing a younger, more vulnerable man striving to find his voice and navigate the complexities of love and friendship. While tinged with the bitterness of later life reflections, particularly concerning some of his literary contemporaries, it also offered a compelling narrative of artistic dedication and the sacrifices made in pursuit of one's calling. The book resonated deeply with aspiring writers and those who romanticized the bohemian life of the lost generation. Beyond A Movable Feast, other works also emerged from his extensive archives. Islands in the Stream, a novel he had worked on for decades, was published in 1970. This sprawling narrative explored themes of fatherhood, loss, and the sea, offering a more introspective and melancholic side of the author. The Dangerous Summer, an account of bullfighting, appeared in 1985, and The Garden of Eden, an unfinished novel delving into themes of gender identity and unconventional relationships, was released in 1986. These posthumous publications collectively offered new insights into Hemingway's creative process, his evolving personal relationships, and the breadth of his literary ambition. They revealed facets of his life and mind that had not been fully explored in his lifetime, while adding layers of complexity to the public perception of the man and his work. While some of these works were edited and compiled by others, they nonetheless contributed to a more comprehensive, if still incomplete, understanding of Ernest Hemingway's enduring literary journey. Ernest Hemingway's enduring literary legacy is deeply rooted in his distinctive prose style and the profound influence he exerted on subsequent generations of writers. His approach to language was revolutionary, characterized by its economy, precision, and a deliberate absence of overt emotionalism. He sought to strip away superfluous words, leaving only the essential elements to convey meaning and evoke feeling. This spare, declarative style became his hallmark. Sentences were often short, direct, and rhythmic, creating a sense of immediacy and understated power. He favoured simple vocabulary and avoided elaborate adjectives or adverbs, believing that strong nouns and verbs carried the true weight of expression. This commitment to clarity and conciseness allowed his narratives to possess a stark beauty, often mirroring the harsh realities faced by his characters. Central to Hemingway's method was his famous iceberg theory, also known as the theory of omission. He posited that the true meaning and emotional depth of a story should not be explicitly stated but rather implied, lying beneath the surface of the text, much like the bulk of an iceberg remains hidden underwater. Only about 1/8 of the iceberg is visible, he argued, and a writer should present only that visible portion, allowing the reader's imagination and intuition to infer the larger, submerged truths. This theory manifested in his narratives through subtle dialogue, unstated motivations, and descriptions that focused on external actions rather than internal monologues. For example, in The Old Man in the Sea, Santiago's profound struggle and quiet dignity are conveyed not through explicit statements of his inner turmoil, but through his persistent actions, his observations of the natural world, and his brief, profound thoughts. The unspoken aspects of his resilience and connection to the marlin are what give the story its powerful emotional resonance. Hemingway's influence on literature was immense and far-reaching. He helped to redefine modern prose, steering it away from the more ornate and discursive styles of earlier eras. Countless writers, both within America and internationally, adopted aspects of his concise, direct approach, recognizing its effectiveness in conveying complex human experiences with understated force. His style became a benchmark for journalistic writing, emphasizing factual reporting and objective observation. His focus on themes of courage, grace under pressure, disillusionment, and the search for meaning in a challenging world also resonated deeply. He shaped the way stories were told, demonstrating that power could be found in restraint and that profound truths could be communicated through simplicity. The Hemingway-esque style became a recognized literary archetype, a testament to his lasting impact on the craft of writing itself. Ernest Hemingway's status as a cultural icon transcends his literary achievements, embedding his image and the themes he explored deeply within the American psyche, and he came to represent a particular ideal of masculinity and adventure, a figure who lived life with an intensity that captured the imagination of a nation. His public persona, carefully cultivated yet seemingly authentic, was as compelling as his fiction. The bearded, rugged man often pictured with a fishing rod in hand, a rifle slung over his shoulder, or a drink in front of him, became synonymous with a certain kind of American grit. He was seen as the adventurous sportsman, the big game hunter, the deep-sea fisherman, the war correspondent who faced danger head-on. This image projected a sense of self-reliance, physical prowess, and an unyielding engagement with the raw elements of existence. This ideal of masculinity, often termed Hemingway-esque, celebrated stoicism, courage in the face of adversity, and a quiet dignity. His characters, like Jake Barnes, Robert Jordan, or Santiago, embodied these traits, enduring suffering without complaint, finding meaning in action, and confronting their fates with a certain grace under pressure. These fictional portrayals reinforced the public perception of Hemingway himself. He was not merely a writer of such men, he was seen as one of them, living out the very ideals he depicted in his prose. His life, filled with travel to exotic locales, Paris, Spain, Africa, Cuba, further cemented his iconic status. These destinations were not just backdrops for his stories, they were integral to the adventurous spirit he embodied. He was seen as a man of the world, untamed and unbound by conventional societal norms, perpetually seeking authentic experiences. This wanderlust resonated with an American spirit that valued exploration and individualism. The themes in his work, bravery, honor, loss, and the struggle against overwhelming forces, spoke to universal human experiences, but they also tapped into specific facets of the American consciousness, particularly in the aftermath of 2 world wars. His narratives offered a form of emotional catharsis and a model for confronting a chaotic world with integrity. Hemingway became more than an author. He became a symbol. He represented a kind of rugged individualism and a pursuit of authentic experience that many Americans admired and aspired to. His image, both real and constructed, became an indelible part of the cultural landscape, representing a potent blend of literary genius and a particular ideal of the American man. Despite his monumental influence and iconic status, Ernest Hemingway's life and work have not been immune to scrutiny and re-evaluation, particularly in contemporary discourse. Ongoing controversies address aspects of his personal conduct and the portrayal of certain groups within his fiction, prompting a more nuanced understanding of his legacy. One significant area of contention revolves around accusations of misogyny. Critics point to the often subordinate roles of female characters in his narratives, who are frequently depicted through the male gaze, existing primarily to serve the emotional or physical needs of the male protagonists. While some argue that this reflects the social norms of his era or the specific perspectives of his characters, others contend that Hemingway's own attitudes towards women, as evidenced in his letters and biographical accounts, informed these portrayals in a problematic way. His complex relationships with his 4 wives and numerous other women, often characterized by power struggles and eventual estrangement, further fuel these discussions. Similarly, questions concerning homophobia have emerged in the re-evaluation of his work. While direct expressions of homophobia might not be overtly pervasive, certain undertones and dismissive portrayals of characters who deviate from conventional masculinity have been noted. This perspective invites a deeper examination of the social anxieties and gender norms prevalent during his time and how they might have manifested in his narratives. Beyond these specific critiques, the broader re-evaluation of Hemingway's problematic aspects in contemporary discourse reflects a changing cultural landscape. Modern literary analysis often considers the socio-political context of a work and its author, moving beyond purely aesthetic judgments to explore ethical implications. This involves examining the colonialist gaze sometimes present in his depictions of non-Western cultures, or the romanticization of violence and hypermasculinity that, while once celebrated, are now viewed through a more critical lens. The intent of such re-evaluations is not to diminish Hemingway's literary genius or his profound impact on prose style. Rather, it is to engage with his work in a more comprehensive and critical manner, acknowledging the complexities and contradictions inherent in both the man and his art. This ongoing process allows for a richer, more informed appreciation of his place in literary history, recognizing both his enduring contributions and the aspects that require thoughtful reconsideration in light of evolving societal values. Ernest Hemingway's enduring presence in the 20th century extends far beyond the pages of his novels and short stories. He occupies a singular and complex position, not merely as a celebrated author, but as a figure who both reflected and profoundly influenced the social, cultural, and political currents that shaped his era. His life became a narrative interwoven with the grand historical movements of his time, making him an inescapable part of the century's fabric. As a writer, his revolutionary prose style, characterized by its economy and directness, he irrevocably altered the landscape of modern literature. He stripped away excess, focusing on the essence of emotion and action, a technique that resonated deeply with a generation emerging from the trauma of global conflict. This stylistic innovation provided a new template for storytelling, influencing countless writers who sought to capture truth with stark clarity. Beyond his literary contributions, Hemingway became a powerful cultural archetype. He embodied a particular vision of American masculinity, forged in the crucible of war, adventure, and the pursuit of intense experiences. His persona, the hunter, the fisherman, the bullfight aficionado, the war correspondent, projected an image of rugged individualism and stoic resilience. This image, cultivated both intentionally and through public perception, and tapped into a collective yearning for strength and authenticity in a rapidly changing world. He became a symbol of a certain kind of freedom and a rejection of perceived societal softness. Politically, Hemingway's engagement, though sometimes complicated and contradictory, aligned him with significant movements. His passionate support for the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War and his active participation in World War II demonstrated a deep conviction in the fight against fascism. He was not a detached observer. He immersed himself in the conflicts, bringing a reporter's eye and a novelist's empathy to the front lines, thereby shaping public perception and contributing to the anti-fascist narrative through his writing and actions. His global travels, from the cafes of Paris to the battlefields of Spain, the plains of Africa, and the waters of Cuba, made him a truly international figure. He captured the spirit of expatriate life, the disillusionment of the lost generation, and the universal struggles of humanity against nature and self. In essence, Hemingway did not merely write about the 20th century. He lived it with an intensity that few others matched, shaping its cultural imagination and leaving an indelible mark on its historical narrative. His legacy, therefore, is not just a collection of books, but a testament to a life lived fully within the tumultuous currents of an extraordinary century. And so we conclude our journey through the life of Ernest Hemingway. It has been a path winding through the quiet beginnings of Oak Park, across the battlefields of Europe, into the vibrant cafes of Paris, the sun-drenched arenas of Spain, the untamed landscapes of Africa, and the tranquil waters surrounding Cuba. Each step has revealed layers of a man whose existence was as complex and contradictory as the century he inhabited. He was a figure of immense talent and profound flaws, a writer whose words shimmered with an almost brutal clarity, yet whose personal narrative was often clouded by inner turmoil and external pressures. The myth he helped to create, that of the stoic, adventurous Papa, stands in stark contrast to the quiet suffering that ultimately consumed him. This duality, this tension between the outward projection of strength and the inward battle with vulnerability, remains one of the most compelling aspects of his story. Hemingway's words, rendered in that distinctive, stripped-down prose, continue to resonate. They speak of courage and fear, love and loss, the beauty of the natural world, and the unyielding struggle against an indifferent universe. His iceberg theory, where much of the meaning lies beneath the surface, mirrors the very nature of his own life, a visible tip of adventure and fame concealing depths of experience, ambition, and pain. The echo he leaves is not a simple one. It is a chorus of critical re-evaluation, an ongoing conversation about the cultural impact of his persona, and a testament to the enduring power of his literary voice. His influence on subsequent generations of writers is undeniable, a quiet, steady current that flows through modern literature. He showed what could be achieved with precision and restraint, how much could be conveyed by saying less? In the grand narrative of human experience, Sir Ernest Hemingway occupies a unique and unshakable place. He was a man who lived with an intensity that bordered on the feverish, always seeking to confront life at its rawest edges. His journey was marked by both triumph and tragedy, a testament to the enduring human spirit and its fragile limits. As the final pages of his story turn, a sense of calm reflection settles, leaving us with the quiet, lingering echo of a life fully, if often tumultuously, lived, and a literary legacy that continues to speak across the passage of time.